In the gentle hush of a world before war songs echoed and fire banners unfurled, a land of green hills and salt-stained coasts grew quietly beneath the grey skies of the northern continent. This place would come to be known as Cintra. Tucked between the bright sprawl of the Yaruga River and the unforgiving tides of the Great Sea, it was never destined to be merely another mark on the map. Cintra bore within it something rarer, a lineage that walked with purpose, and land whose cliffs would one day cradle the fate of kings, sorcerers, and a child born of prophecy. Before we begin tracing the fall and fragile beauty of that kingdom, I'd be honored if you like this video and consider subscribing, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. The tale of Cintra begins not with thrones or towers, but with footholds in wilderness. The early human settlers of the region arrived in scattered waves sometime after the conjunction of the spheres, which had thrown open the doorways between realms and birthed an unfamiliar continent filled with monsters, magic, and men who were still learning to live alongside both. These were difficult times, marked not by unity, but endurance. Communities were small, clinging to the low hills and forest edges, surviving by the sea's bounty and the stony fields that lined the southern shores. In those days, the land lacked any name. Its future rulers had not yet been born, and its sovereignty remained untouched. The early settlers, guided more by necessity than ambition, established small hill forts near the coast and carved roads from forest to cliff, weaving new paths from old elven trails and forgotten dwarven stonework. They were aware of the continent's older inhabitants, the elder races, but uneasy cohabitation was often interrupted by suspicion and fear. Yet over generations, human influence grew steadily. The name Cintra, in fact, is believed by some chroniclers to have come from an older Einsaidha phrase, Zintrathal, loosely translated to mean ridge of salt or wind-swept boundary. Others claim it derived from the Cintrian tongue itself, a corruption of the word Cindra, meaning sun-washed or bright crown. Whatever the truth, by the time of the first recorded highland councils, gatherings of the largest human settlements in the region, the name Cintra had already taken root, whispered around fire circles and chiseled into border stones. The early Cintran clans were fiercely independent, marked more by shared hardship than by shared blood. But over time, one name began to emerge more frequently among the chieftains and warriors of the southern Yaruga. House Calanthe, later known simply as the ruling house of Cintra, traces its ancestry to the old clan of Rayloth, a coastal family whose leadership was shaped less by noble decree and more by salt-hardened pragmatism. They commanded ships when the forests choked the roads and settled disputes with quiet precision. Slowly, their influence spread inland. By the early centuries following the human expansion across the continent, the Rayloth line had established itself as the central organizing power in the Cintran highlands. They unified smaller hamlets and fortress towns under a single banner. Their crest, a silver sun upon a blue sea, represented more than just regional pride. It came to symbolize stability. And in a land so often marked by flood, drought, and skirmish, stability was rare enough to be treasured. The founding of the city of Cintra itself, nestled in a natural bowl of hills and cliffs above the Gulf of Praxida, marked the beginning of the kingdom's transformation from a scattering of holdfasts into a political force. Built first as a fortified town, more watchtower than capital, it grew quickly. The surrounding region, blessed with fertile inland plains and rich fisheries, made the city a hub for trade. Ships from the southern Yaruga ports soon began to arrive in its docks, bringing dyes from Gesso, spices from Matina, and stories from every bend of the river. Within a generation, the town had grown into a true city. Stone towers replaced timber watchposts, and paved roads radiated outward toward the foothills and beyond. The inland provinces swore fealty to the Rayloth lords, who were by now referred to by a new title, Kings of Cintra. With this transition came the need for court, council, and code. The Rayloth dynasty became the beating heart of Cintran politics, and with each successive ruler, the kingdom pushed its borders further and fortified its influence across the south. But while strength rose from within, so too did tensions from without. The kingdom's location placed it at the crossroads of larger ambitions. Temeria to the northwest, Redania to the north, and the ever-watchful Nilfgaardian Empire across the sea to the south had begun to take note of Cintra's rising prominence. For now, those glances remained distant. Trade, after all, had more value than conquest in those years. But the roots of future conflict had already found soil. In time, House Raelotha's bloodline narrowed and reformed. The name Calanthe would come later, a matronymic passed down from the granddaughter of Queen Bressa, a sovereign of fire-hearted reputation and ruthless diplomatic insight. Calanthe became not just a name, but a legacy, a symbol of a ruler who would one day carry that name and transform the kingdom into something greater than any of her ancestors had envisioned. The land beneath Cintra's towers held stories older than even the elves remembered, and its waters lapped at shores that would one day carry whispers of exile, prophecy, and ruin. Yet in these early years, before the lion cub of Cintra took the throne, the kingdom's rise was steady, proud, and wrapped in the scent of sea wind and orchard blossom. The hills remained green. The towers rose taller. And in the quiet rooms of the citadel, where stone met scroll and the ink of treaties dried beside blades, the future of Cintra waited patiently for the footsteps of destiny. When Calanthe was born into the royal halls of Cintra, there was little reason to suspect the full measure of her future. She entered the world during the closing years of her grandfather King Daggerad's reign, when the kingdom stood quietly prosperous yet wary. Daggerad was not a king of spectacle, but a ruler of careful steps and measured counsel. His leadership had seen Cintra avoid war even as tensions simmered beyond its borders. The court of Cintra during those years favored tradition, and its advisors often viewed youth with suspicion. Yet in Calanthe, something stirred early, a presence that moved through the stone corridors with quiet confidence, watching, listening, learning. As a child, Calanthe showed an unusual interest in matters of rule. While other noble children favored sport, she requested to sit in on court discussions. Though her tutors urged caution, the king allowed it. Perhaps he sensed what others did not yet understand. Even as a girl, Calanthe did not simply observe, she absorbed. By the age of 10, she could quote from royal charters and argue the finer points of river rights with veteran stewards. Her gaze was direct, her speech clipped and firm, and her temper, when tested, struck like a sharpened hawk's beak. When King Daggerad passed from this world, the crown passed briefly to Calanthe's father. But the winds of fate are not always long in one direction. He would not rule long. Illness, or perhaps misfortune, claimed him quickly. And so, barely past her 15th summer, Calanthe stood before the silver and blue banners of Cintra and was crowned queen. Many in the court doubted her. Even among her own advisors, whispers curled like smoke in the stairwells. A child, they said. A girl who knew words but not wars. A ruler in name, not yet in truth. But Calanthe, as always, wasted little time in argument. She answered with actions. She summoned her captains, reviewed the kingdom's standing pacts, and restructured her council with cold precision. Those who hesitated to serve a young queen were dismissed. Those who questioned her right to rule were sent quietly to the provinces. She kept the most loyal, rewarded the wisest, and watched the rest with keen awareness. Within 2 years, the court of Cintra no longer muttered doubts. The lion cub of Cintra, as her people began to call her, had silenced critics not with cruelty, but with unshakable competence. She traveled the breadth of her kingdom, meeting stewards and lords, presiding over grain disputes, sea tariffs, and border conflicts. Where other monarchs might have left such matters to delegates, Calanthe took the reins herself. The name Lion Cub first appeared in a jesting ballad performed during the harvest festival in the 2nd year of her reign. Intended perhaps to mock her youth, it was quickly reinterpreted by her allies. The lion, after all, is not diminished by its size if its claws are sharp. Calanthe, they said, was no cub to be coddled. She was a young lion watching from the tall grass, already prepared to lead the hunt. It was during this period that Calanthe began forging the web of alliances that would later sustain Cintra's golden years. She opened new trade talks with Skellige, recognizing the importance of sea routes and the strategic advantage of goodwill among the isles. Her diplomacy was clever, favoring hospitality over harshness. She hosted emissaries in her own court chambers, allowing them to witness firsthand the order and strength of her rule. With Temeria, she maintained a cordial, if cautious, understanding. With Redania, she danced the steps of tradition and patience, careful never to commit too much nor promise too little. Cintra's neighbors took notice. Calanthe's rule had reshaped the kingdom's posture. Where once it stood as a prosperous but peripheral state, it now held influence beyond its borders. And within the realm itself, her presence inspired loyalty. The people saw in her a monarch who walked their fields, listened to their troubles, and returned home with solutions, not platitudes. In the inner chambers of her court, Calanthe maintained a close circle of advisors. Among them were military leaders, economic minds, and one or two discreet sources from far beyond Cintra's boundaries. She understood early that power was not merely about territory or coin, but about knowledge. She paid handsomely for information, on troop movements, on changing tides of royal favor in neighboring courts, on the whisperings of mags and merchant guilds. In all things, she remained aware. Yet for all her political mastery, Calanthe was never removed from her people. Festivals remained central to Cintran life, and Calanthe made a point of appearing during public rites, dances, and seasonal gatherings. She was rarely the first to speak, but always the last to leave. Her presence brought pride, and her words, when given, resonated. She spoke clearly, often without ceremony, and favored plain truths over poetic flourishes. In the 6th year of her rule, Calanthe began courtship negotiations with several regional princes. Yet none suited her ambition. Some were too pliant, others too proud. In the end, she chose not to wed for alliance, but for love, or, at the very least, for strong partnership. It would not be until much later, after years of reign, that she would choose Iced to Siege of Skellige. Their bond would carry its own weight in Cintra's future, but in these early days, Calanthe stood alone, steady and sovereign. As the seasons passed, the shape of her court matured with her. Where once advisors had questioned her age, they now feared her insight. Where once nobles sought to steer her decisions, they now worked only to keep pace with her plans. And beyond the court, her reputation spread. In Temeria, they called her the Lioness who watches. In Redania, the White Queen of the Southern Sea. In Nilfgaard, though they seldom said so openly, her name was marked in reports and memoranda with underlined caution. Calanthe's rule had elevated Cintra. What had begun as a promising province had become a kingdom worthy of respect. But greatness often invites shadow, and even as Cintra blossomed, the faint echoes of future storms could be heard beyond the horizon. Ships crossed southern waters with more frequency, bearing colors unfamiliar. Emissaries from Nilfgaard asked more questions than they answered. The world was changing. Still, within the gilded walls of her court, beneath the high windows that overlooked the sea, Queen Calanthe stood resolute. The lion cub had grown into a monarch of unmatched presence. Her name carried weight, and her kingdom moved with purpose. The high tides washed against Cintra's stone harbors. The breeze lifted the banners. And in the quiet before dawn, the queen rose early, always one step ahead of the dawn's demands. The reign of Queen Calanthe entered a phase that many would later describe as Cintra's golden hour, a stretch of years when the kingdom flourished in every sense, and the ripples of its prosperity touched even the edges of distant courts. Though conflict always stirred somewhere beyond the hills and seas, within Cintra's own borders, calm took root. Harvests grew richer, merchant roads swelled with color and language, and the halls of the citadel echoed not with alarms or disputes, but with music, laughter, and deliberation guided by a firm but far-seeing crown. It was in this period that Calanthe began to shift her attention from simply preserving the throne to shaping the future of the realm itself. The outer provinces, once loosely bound to the capital, were brought more tightly into alignment through a system of regular audits and royal progressions. The queen herself would tour these lands at least once every 2 years, accompanied by advisors, clerks, and healers, signs not of conquest, but of governance. Her presence in the provinces was not ceremonial. She listened to disputes in person, approved infrastructure plans, and made note of those leaders who proved capable, as well as those who merely played at authority. Cintra's geography gave it natural advantages that Calanthe was quick to reinforce. The Yaruga River remained a spine of commerce, carrying goods from inland towns to the sea, and from the sea to distant cities. Its ports, once humble, were now bustling. Dockmasters spoke in tongues from Zerrikania to Mahakam, and coin flowed in through trades in lumber, salt fish, cloth, and imported luxuries. Calanthe's treasury grew, not from conquest or taxes alone, but from carefully cultivated trade that spanned both water and land. In the capital, Cintra itself underwent transformation. The old stone of the fortress walls was repaired and reinforced. New towers were added, not only for defense, but to house scholars, scribes, and magical advisors. A great library was commissioned, gathering scrolls and tomes from across the continent. While never a rival to the mighty Aretusa or Oxenfurt, Cintra's academic halls became respected, particularly in studies of governance, navigation, and diplomacy. The court itself reflected this newfound maturity. Calanthe's advisors no longer fretted over her youth. Instead, they followed her with respect and careful attention, for her memory was sharp and her expectations high. Those who served her best were rewarded with the queen's trust, something far rarer and more valuable. New faces joined the inner circle during these years, stewards of unusual insight, mags with balanced counsel, and spies whose networks fed the throne with whispers long before they became shouts. Among her most trusted was a Skellige captain named Eist Tuur Siech, whose quiet strength and steady judgment earned Calanthe's admiration over years of shared counsel. Though their marriage would not come until later, their growing closeness became a quiet fixture in courtly life. Eist, unlike many noble suitors, did not vie for attention or station. He offered only loyalty, discretion, and calm conversation in a court that often bristled with formality. It was in this season of stability that Calanthe began to consider legacy, not only of throne, but of lineage. Meanwhile, the culture of Cintra blossomed. Poets found patronage in the court. Musicians, sculptors, and dramatists returned to the capital with new works. Calanthe herself took interest in the presentation of tradition, commissioning ballads to preserve the stories of the common folk. Tales of the Yaruga fishermen, of forest-dwelling traders, of lost daughters and wise grandmothers became woven into the court's entertainment, blending the lives of the people with the pride of the state. The annual spring equinox festival became the kingdom's most cherished gathering, drawing participants from every corner of the realm and even from neighboring lands. In those days, the streets of Cintra would flood with dancers, merchants, and bright banners. Knights jousted for honor. Children played beneath garlands of woven herbs. And the queen, dressed in simple blues and silver, would preside over the rites with a smile touched more by memory than ceremony. It was a time of clear skies over the kingdom. Even as word of Nilfgaard's growing appetite trickled in from southern traders, and the northern realms shifted allegiances behind closed doors, Calanthe held Cintra steady. She balanced diplomacy with resolve, strengthening ties where she could and cooling tensions when needed. To Temeria, she sent casks of Yaruga wine and carefully worded letters. To Redania, she offered joint patrols of common border paths. And to Nilfgaard, when their emissaries grew curious about Cintra's fleet, she responded with sharp-edged courtesy and veiled strength. The kingdom's army, while never vast, had grown in discipline and training. Calanthe favored quality over sheer numbers. Her knights were drilled not only in formation and blade, but in negotiation, scouting, and survival. A special unit known as the Crown's Wind, light cavalry scouts trained to move quickly across any terrain, became a symbol of Cintran readiness, often seen at festivals and border musters alike. Within the court, however, new dynamics began to surface. As the queen aged into her third decade of rule, questions of succession began to rise more often in closed council. Her advisors wondered aloud, sometimes gently, sometimes less so, about heirs, about continuity, about the preservation of all she had built. Calanthe, ever forward-thinking, answered with action. She announced her intent to marry Iced to Urseach, not for advantage, but for companionship. And soon after, the court learned of the child that would come, the daughter named Pavetta. This child would be born into a kingdom secure, prosperous, and well-governed. But the birth of Pavetta marked the beginning of a shift, not a decline yet, but a turning of the tide. For with lineage came destiny, and with destiny came a weight that even queens could not always anticipate. In those golden years, however, the citadel still rang with music. Ships came and went from the coast with sails high and clean. Merchants crossed Cintran roads in safety, and children grew in the fields without fear of torch or scream. The Lioness ruled, and the land knew peace. But beyond the southern sea, across the wine-dark waters that lapped quietly against the Cintran cliffs, something older stirred, watching, waiting, and measuring time in colder ways than any mortal crown. As Queen Calanthe's influence extended outward from the stone halls of the citadel and into the wider web of northern kingdoms, the realm of Cintra entered a more complex chapter of its history. These were the years when peace depended less on the strength of blades and more on the weight of words. Across the northern continent, alliances shifted like river ice in the spring thaw, slow at first, then with sudden cracks and realignments. Within this changing landscape, Calanthe maneuvered with the poise of a seasoned hunter. To the northwest, Temeria watched Cintra's rise with careful interest. King Foltest, seated in the capital of Vizima, was a man known for pragmatic ambition. His realm, larger and more resource-rich than Cintra, relied on a patchwork of noble houses and merchant cities. Foltest understood the value of strong neighbors, but he was wary of rising stars. Envoys between Cintra and Temeria became more frequent during these years. Some brought trade offers, others proposals for coordinated patrols along the lower Yaruga. Calanthe, ever a measured reader of intent, accepted the cordiality without surrendering the crown's independence. She sent her own emissaries, scholars, quartermasters, and even musicians, using diplomacy and culture as twin threads to bind relations subtly. Northward, the realm of Redania maintained a colder posture. Under the crown of King Vizimir, Redania's focus remained turned toward Cadwin and the Ponta. Yet Redanian spies walked the courts of the south, their presence noted if rarely named. Cintra, with its growing fleet and secure southern roads, had become valuable not only for trade but for its role as a coastal buffer. Calanthe responded with tact. She invited Redanian scholars to attend seasonal gatherings and commissioned a rare geological survey of shared mineral veins along their western hills, an offering of shared curiosity. Though Vizimir offered few personal replies, his advisors began appearing more often in the Cintran court. To the south, Nilfgaard was awakening. Still officially a distant empire beyond the river delta and the great seas, its merchants had begun pressing into northern markets with greater urgency. Caravans flying the Black Sun banner appeared in port towns more regularly, their goods varied and their prices generous. But beneath the commerce, Calanthe sensed the pattern. With every agreement signed, Nilfgaard sought a foothold, trade posts that became warehouses, warehouses that requested guards, guards that asked for land. Calanthe responded without noise. She enacted new tariffs requiring goods from the empire to be offloaded outside the city and moved inland by local carriers. Nilfgaardian ambassadors protested mildly, but the queen's reasoning was clear. Cintra welcomed trade, but but it would not become a host for another power's roots. Her message carried through every decree. Cintra was a sovereign light in the southern sky. Within the court itself, diplomacy remained a dance of glances and nuance. Courtiers from distant lands arrived with crafted smiles and memorized compliments, yet Calanthe met them with ease. She had learned long ago that confidence came from certainty. During council dinners, she would often allow others to speak first, observing tone, gesture, and omission. Then, with a single question or a raised brow, she would shift the room's current. The Lioness did not roar in council. She steered. The internal court also grew more structured. A new division was established beneath the steward's chamber, a bureau of external affairs, headed by an elder diplomat named Maela Avild. Maela had served 3 kings before her and spoke 5 languages. Under Calanthe's direction, he transformed Cintra's records into a living archive, tracking alliances, debts, inheritance lines, and even rumors tied to regional disputes. The Crown's foreign policy, once reactive, became predictive. It was during these years that Calanthe first received word of increased shipbuilding in Nilfgaard's coastal provinces. The Empire, though far to the south, had begun to outfit vessels for distance. Naval patterns shifted. Harbour masters in Gesso and Ebbing logged unusual traffic. Some captains reported seeing Nilfgaardian banners deeper into the Gulf than ever before. Calanthe listened closely to these reports. She commissioned her own shipwrights to inspect Cintra's naval defences. The docks were improved. The sails were replaced. Warships were quietly prepared in anticipation. Diplomacy, however, was not only foreign. Within Cintra's own borders, noble families remained a constant presence in the corridors of influence. Though loyal, many carried their own ambitions. Calanthe allowed them room to move, but not to stray. She summoned them to seasonal councils, required public oaths of fealty, and reminded each lord that their privilege was derived from service, not lineage alone. Her justiciars toured the counties with regularity, settling disputes, standardizing coinage, and inspecting border defenses. One of the more delicate internal maneuvers came during the negotiation of trade routes through Sodden. The region's hills held strategic value, and Calanthe understood the necessity of securing unobstructed passage for both merchants and scouts. Rather than demand or threaten, she invited Sodden's elders to a month-long gathering at the citadel under the pretense of a harvest symposium. Over shared meals and quiet walks, terms were set. A charter was signed. Cintra gained what it needed. Sodden gained respect and renewed trade shares. Calanthe's court during these years was marked by calm rhythm rather than pageantry. Visitors noted the lack of excessive display. The queen sat among her councillors. Her meals were plain. Her chambers were more library than throne room. Yet the strength of her presence filled every hall. Those who underestimated her left corrected. Those who came in sincerity often returned with friendship. The political landscape across the northern continent remained ever-shifting, yet Cintra stood balanced, neither isolated nor overextended. Calanthe's skill rested in her ability to read the deeper tide beneath each current event, responding with strategy instead of pride. Her realm remained independent, respected, and vigilant. As the banners fluttered above the sea wall and the bells rang for evening prayer in the city below, the queen walked her gardens without entourage, thinking of preparations. The court was quiet, but awake, and beyond the candlelit windows of the royal library, the world continued to turn, measured, watched, and, for now, held in peace. In the quiet hours that followed high court gatherings, when candles burned low and servants moved like whispers through the palace corridors, Queen Calanthe often held private discussions in the study behind the southern chamber hall. These were the conversations that shaped the kingdom's future with subtle precision, unrecorded in official ledgers, but remembered well by those involved. Among the many names that crossed her lips during such meetings, one began to recur more frequently during the middle years of her reign: Rience. Rience was not a prince, nor a lord of any recognized province. He came from lesser noble blood, educated in Oxenfurt and trained as a diplomat in the early courts of Kovir. His name appeared first in correspondence connected to magical studies and minor coastal treaties. By the time his presence was acknowledged in Cintra's archives, Rience had already established himself as a capable negotiator with a mind for quiet infiltration. Calanthe kept her distance from him at first, choosing to observe rather than engage directly. Reports from agents across Gesso and Matina noted Rience's movements through southern ports. He traveled under different banners, always on diplomatic errands, but his interests often strayed beyond trade. He lingered in harbor towns after meetings ended. He visited booksellers and arcane suppliers. His expenses were recorded with strange precision, each coin accounted for down to the last dinar. The Queen requested more detailed reports. Her informants described Rience as composed, methodical, and well-connected. He did not carry himself like a rogue or mercenary, nor did he dress as a courtly envoy. His presence suggested purpose, and his attention to detail earned him the trust of several merchant houses with ties to both Nilfgaard and the northern realms. This duality intrigued Calanthe. Recognizing the opportunity, she authorized a covert invitation. Disguised as a neutral trade consultation, the meeting took place in the lower gallery of the Cintran court during a routine naval summit. Rience presented himself as respectful and knowledgeable. He discussed mineral tariffs with practiced ease, but Calanthe noted the way he shifted conversation toward troop logistics, port capabilities, and magical surveillance measures. His questions were cautious, and his conclusions came swiftly. Rather than dismiss him, Calanthe engaged further. She asked direct questions about Nilfgaard's recent activities, fleet construction, military expansion, and the Empire's growing interest in the northern trade routes. Rience offered no accusations, but his tone suggested awareness. He referenced shifts in Nilfgaardian policy, including the appointment of new naval ministers and subtle reorganizations of southern patrol zones. He spoke of these changes without fanfare, allowing the weight of each detail to settle on its own. Following the meeting, Calanthe instructed her advisors to monitor Rience's correspondence. What they found was consistent with his earlier reports: no duplicity, no betrayal, but a growing pattern of contact with individuals tied to both magical circles and covert scouting parties. Rience had positioned himself as a bridge between power blocks, neither fully committed to any, but always present where knowledge passed hands. During this time, Cintra's own magical advisors grew more involved in statecraft. The presence of sorcerers and enchantresses in Calanthe's court was not unusual. Magic had always played a role in royal affairs, but their involvement now extended into matters of espionage and external affairs. One such advisor, Lady Mavella, confirmed that Rience's interests aligned increasingly with Nilfgaardian agents operating in the field. He was not formally affiliated, yet his proximity to their movements suggested deeper coordination. Rather than issue warnings or send official letters, Calanthe chose to adjust her own strategies. She expanded the Cintran intelligence network southward. Quiet agents were placed in caravan stations and port cities. Shipping manifests were reviewed more thoroughly. A discreet magical scrying post was established near the cliffs above the Gulf of Praxida, allowing arcane surveillance over sea routes that Rience's associates often traveled. These changes did not disrupt the public image of peace. Trade continued, festivals were held, and foreign envoys were received with customary grace. Yet within the stone walls of the citadel, a new layer of vigilance took root. Calanthe was preparing for sustained awareness. Rience, for his part, continued to move across borders. In meetings that followed, he offered occasional insights into the intentions of rival courts. He never named his sources, and Calanthe never pressed. Their conversations were brief, often during hunts or garden walks when fewer ears were present. He provided perspective, accurate, though limited. Calanthe listened, filed the knowledge away, and continued her preparations. Through Rience, the Queen gained a clearer view of the growing web that connected Nilfgaard to the shifting politics of the north. It became evident that influence flowed not only through armies or treaties, but through advisors, agents, and individuals who carried no banners at all. Though Rience eventually drifted further into darker channels, as later years would confirm, his role during this period was less defined by allegiance and more by information. He was a mirror for Calanthe, revealing the depth of connections and the reach of southern ambitions. In the Great Hall, where sea breezes lifted the edge of the blue banners above the throne, Calanthe kept her hands folded quietly during audience hours. She greeted emissaries with ease, reviewed ledgers without hesitation, and accepted gifts with calm grace. Yet her mind remained sharp, guided by the knowledge that power did not move in open ranks alone. It walked in shadowed corridors, spoke in quiet tones, and wore the robes of advisors as often as it wore armor. The sun rose and set on Cintra's towers, steady and golden. The court continued its rhythms. But within those rhythms, new chords had begun to hum, low, steady, and unbroken. As the years advanced and the shape of the continent shifted further beneath the surface, Queen Calanthe turned increasingly to the subtle signs that marked change, signs carved in patterns of behavior, changes in silence, and words left unspoken in diplomatic gatherings. These were the early warnings that rarely came with alarms but always arrived with weight. Along the southern shores, where Cintra's fishing towns mingled with merchant docks and wind-worn keeps, the flow of traffic began to change. Trade remained strong, yet certain captains sailed with unusual caution. They avoided traditional stopovers, changed routes without clear cause, and left port under cover of night more often than before. When questioned, they offered little more than vague replies about taxes or tides. But Calanthe's harbour masters noted the consistency. Something had unsettled them. Among the kingdom's network of inland stewards and magistrates, reports filtered in of travelling merchants who asked unusual questions about muster stations, river fords, and grain stores. These visitors claimed southern heritage, often arriving with proper documents and coin, yet their interest rested less on trade and more on logistics. In court, Calanthe received increasingly frequent correspondence from fellow monarchs. Some letters brought reassurances, others bore inquiries thinly veiled as pleasantries. Temeria expressed concern about troop movements along the Amel Pass. Redania sought updated maps of the lower Yaruga crossings. Cadwyn, though distant, quietly requested Cintra's assessment of Nilfgaard's recent grain surpluses and weather anomalies, details which seemed unimportant unless viewed with the right lens. The Queen did not panic. She listened, sorted, and measured. Her advisors were summoned for longer meetings, and her generals reviewed their deployment strategies. Supplies were accounted for, and muster rosters quietly updated. Military preparations were not issued by decree. Instead, they appeared in the margins, ship repairs authorized in new batches, drills extended by a few days, messenger routes doubled. Within the capital, the air changed subtly. Servants moved more quickly. Advisors paused longer before replying. The court maintained its outward grace, yet a stillness crept into the quieter chambers. Even during festivals, when music echoed across the coastal slopes and garlands framed the old stones, Calanthe's gaze lingered longer toward the sea. Among the sorcerers attached to the Cintran court, there were murmurs of deeper shifts. Magical readings from the southern borders suggested sudden movements of energy, nothing overt, yet persistent. Circles of mags in Pontvonis and Gors Velen reported similar sensations. Discussions among senior arcanists reflected growing concern that Nilfgaard was preparing to reshape the continent's structure. Calanthe requested private consultations with several trusted mags. She asked about teleportation grids, ley lines, and arcane channels that might allow an empire to move more quickly than ships or hooves could account for. The responses were cautious, yet affirmed her suspicions. Nilfgaard had begun drawing magical expertise into its own service, often through indirect patronage. The Southern Empire, while publicly dismissive of magic's authority, quietly gathered knowledge for strategic use. Despite these signs, the court remained composed. Cintran leadership favored strength through preparation. The army maintained its readiness. Scouts increased their range. Naval crews drilled with greater precision. On the surface, Cintra presented the same vibrant face, a kingdom of order, culture, and resolve. But behind that image stood readiness. Calanthe remained calm in every setting. She greeted her guests with the same measured grace, attended council meetings with full attention, and reviewed every report with careful thought. Yet she also expanded her network. Riders were sent more frequently across the Yaruga. Old alliances were revisited with quiet inquiries. The Queen moved through the landscape of northern politics with awareness sharpened by years of governance. Among her advisors, few doubted the significance of these changes. The Minister of Grain, long accustomed to managing stores and trade quotas, now shared evening discussions with the Master of Arms and the Royal Steward. Conversations stretched into night, with maps unrolled and timelines compared. They did not speak of fear, they spoke of necessity. In the border villages, the Queen's presence remained felt. Relief caravans reached the outer provinces in greater volume. Healers traveled with court-appointed guards, offering assistance to communities in need. These acts, though framed as seasonal kindness, also served another purpose. They strengthened the bond between crown and people, ensuring loyalty through care. News from Gesso and Maked brought further concern. Nilfgaard's administrative expansion accelerated. Roads were improved for movement of larger columns. River crossings were fortified under the guise of flood preparation. Displaced nobles began arriving in northern courts, their titles stripped, their houses reassigned. Some sought shelter. Others brought warnings. Calanthe welcomed their words and offered sanctuary when it served the realm. She questioned each guest carefully, recording names, places, and conditions. Every fragment of testimony shaped a broader picture, one where Nilfgaard no longer sought to coexist with the north, but to absorb it. Within the citadel, the Queen walked the inner balcony before sunrise, wrapped in a blue cloak against the morning chill. Below, the city stirred, the sound of carts, of bells, of distant gulls riding the coastal winds. It was the sound of a realm awake, still whole, and still in motion. The early warnings had arrived. Quiet, steady, undeniable. As the kingdom of Cintra grew into the fullness of its power and watched the shadows gathering along the southern horizon, a different sort of weight began to press more closely within the stone walls of the citadel, a weight shaped not by empire or politics, but by legacy, inheritance, and the quiet tether of blood that bound rulers to those who would follow them. Pavetta was born in the spring following a season of calm. The sea had kept its distance from the cliffs that year, and the fruit trees in the high orchards bloomed early. Her arrival brought joy to the court and relief to the Queen's advisors, many of whom had long spoken of the need for clear succession. The child bore the features of both her parents, Calanthe's pale eyes and sharp brow, iced to Ursiche's calm demeanor and quiet, sea-bound strength. But there was something else, too, an intensity beneath the child's gaze that even the midwives noticed, though few dared to comment openly. From her earliest years, Pavetta was raised with care, but not seclusion. Calanthe believed in proximity to duty, and the girl attended court proceedings as soon as she could sit still long enough to observe. Tutors were selected not only for their knowledge, but for their discretion. The child showed a keen understanding of language and law, and her questions, when voiced, carried weight beyond her age. Yet those closest to her also recognized the presence of something deeper. A quiet hum of power threaded through her being, subtle but unmistakable. Pavetta's moods were often accompanied by shifts in room temperature, the trembling of flame, or the soft tension in glass. It was not magic learned, but something older, something born. Calanthe took note. Though not a practitioner herself, she had long worked beside mags and advisors versed in the arcane. She consulted them carefully, without raising alarm. The consensus was quiet but firm. Pavetta bore the signs of elder blood, an ancient line of magical potential traced through elven ancestry and human mingling, known for its rarity and its consequences. The queen chose discretion. She did not hide her daughter, nor did she advertise the bloodline. Pavetta remained part of court life, educated, polished, and shielded from unnecessary scrutiny. Her magical tendencies were addressed in private. Calanthe ensured that her daughter's future would be shaped by will, not fear. In Pavetta's 15th year, a gathering was arranged in the royal hall to celebrate her name day and entertain potential suitors. Such events were common across the northern kingdoms, often staged as polite affairs of pageantry and alliance. Lords and envoys arrived bearing gifts, songs were sung, and toasts raised. Yet among the guests stood one who was neither noble in title nor familiar to the court. He called himself Junie, a knight of foreign blood, masked by a strange affliction. His appearance was unsettling, partly cloaked, partly cursed. He bore the signs of a man who had lived in shadow, yet his tone was measured and his purpose clear. He had come to claim a promise. The court stirred as he spoke of the law of surprise, a tradition older than kingdoms, bound in oath and custom. Years earlier, he had saved King Rona's life, Pavetta's late father. In return, he had invoked the law, that which the king had at home yet did not know. That promise had turned out to be Pavetta. The hall quieted. Calanthe rose. Her advisors whispered in haste. The law of surprise, though rare in courtly speech, was binding under older codes, respected by witches, merchants, and even monarchs. Calanthe, however, did not yield immediately. She questioned Junie's truth, challenged his right, and weighed her daughter's will before any decree. Yet even as arguments unfurled across the stone hall, something stirred within Pavetta. Junie's presence awakened a force long held in check. Her emotions surged, and with them, the latent magic that had rested deep within her blood. The torches flared. Air thickened. Plates trembled upon the tables. In that moment, Pavetta's elder blood revealed itself fully. The raw energy she released was powerful enough to shake the very hall, throwing courtiers to the ground and forcing the queen herself to step back in alarm. Only Junie remained calm, holding her gaze. It was not destruction that followed, but convergence. Pavetta's magic did not lash out in harm. It circled her like a windstorm, fierce but controlled. The court, breathless and silent, saw not only a girl, but a force of inheritance. Calanthe, regaining her footing, approached the center of the hall. She looked not at Junie, but at her daughter. Then, with quiet certainty, she acknowledged the bond. The law of surprise stood affirmed. The two would be wed by convergence, blood, magic, and fate intertwining. That night, after the hall had emptied and the candles were extinguished, Calanthe stood alone by the window overlooking the sea. The surf moved with calm rhythm against the stone. She understood now that Pavetta's path would not be a simple matter of inheritance. It carried the weight of prophecy. In a kingdom where diplomacy had kept borders intact and ships carried news rather than soldiers, the awakening of elder blood reshaped the conversation. Pavetta was more than air. She was a thread within something far older than Cintra's line. And somewhere beyond the horizon, others would sense that thread beginning to stir. The stars remained steady above the cliffs. The wind moved softly through the garden branches. And within the citadel's inner chambers, a door had quietly opened, one that led not only towards succession, but towards stories far larger than the court had yet imagined. In the deep stillness of winter, when the coastal winds carved frost across the orchard branches and the court wrapped its halls in heavy woolen banners, a child was born beneath the high ceiling of the Cintran royal wing. Her name was Cirilla Fiona Ellen Rhiannon, called Ciri by those who cradled her first. The room was warm, filled with the scent of sea lavender and burning juniper, the wards placed carefully by royal midwives and magical advisors alike. Her mother, Pavetta, rested beneath embroidered sheets, her breathing calm. Her father, Junie, now recognized by the court as Lord Urchin of Erlenwald, stood nearby, his affliction lifted, his voice steady. The birth was without complication. No flames danced, no furniture shook. Yet even in the quiet of that morning, the midwives would later speak of a sensation, a stillness that felt less like peace and more like attention, as if something ancient had paused to witness the moment. Queen Calanthe held her granddaughter with hands that had once directed fleets, shaped treaties, and silenced entire chambers with a glance. Yet here she did not speak. She looked into the child's eyes, bright green, ringed with a shade neither grey nor gold, and saw something she could not fully name, a presence, a path. Not one shaped by her own will, but one that would shape Cintra in return. Ciri's birth was marked with celebration across the kingdom. Banners were hung along the citadel's balconies, and offerings arrived from allies near and far. Temeria sent silver basin sets and finely tooled scrollwork. Redania offered a lacquered cradle inset with rubies. Even Skellige, ever brash and uncompromising, delivered 3 white seal pelts and a brooch carved from sea stone, the Tuersiche crest rendered in deep etching. Within the court, songs were composed and recitations held. The child was hailed as the future of Cintra, uniting the lineages of Raloth, Calanthe, and the mysterious bloodlines stretching back through Pavetta to ancient days. The people rejoiced. For many, it marked the continuation of prosperity, the confirmation of the Lioness's legacy. But outside the revelry, in the quieter wings of the court, a different kind of conversation unfolded. Magical advisors, those closest to Pavetta's upbringing, had begun to sense the rhythm beneath the child's heartbeat. Ciri's power did not flare as Pavetta's had during her youth. It ran colder, quieter, like a river beneath ice. Yet it carried far more weight. Elder blood, once a curiosity bound in half-forgotten elven prophecy, now pulsed through a child of known lineage, protected by a throne, and watched by eyes across the continent. Among those most familiar with the ancient lines was Mousesack, the Skellige druid who had advised Iced and remained loyal to Calanthe. His understanding of blood magic and prophecy was drawn from the oral traditions of the islands, songs and dreams passed between generations of seers. When he held the child, he did not smile. He nodded, closed his eyes briefly, and spoke only once, "She will walk paths we cannot follow." Others began to take notice beyond the borders. Elven scholars whispered of Lara Doran, the ancestor whose bloodline had stirred storms between human kings and the Aen Seidr. Mags in Aretuza debated the implications, some calling for guidance, others for distance. To those versed in prophecy, particularly Ithlins, Ciri represented a convergence point. The child of the elder blood, according to the verses, would bring renewal or ruin, depending on which voices one heeded. Calanthe, pragmatic and ever grounded, dismissed the more fevered interpretations. She refused to have her granddaughter's life dictated by verses, and she restricted formal discussions of prophecy within court circles. Ciri would be raised as a princess, trained in governance, horsemanship, language, and etiquette. She would not be a pawn for magical speculation, nor a symbol for things the queen could not touch. Even so, Calanthe made preparations. Discreet correspondences were sent to Aretuza, requesting insights into magical education without making promises. Trusted knights were assigned to the royal nursery. The guards at the southern wall were rotated more frequently, and the number of messengers entering from beyond the Yaruga was closely monitored. The Queen also restructured her personal archives. Documents detailing Ciri's ancestry, some of them reaching into elven records centuries old, were secured in a sealed chamber beneath the library. Only a few were granted access. She was building a wall of knowledge around her granddaughter to protect. As the months turned to years, Ciri grew strong. She rode before she could properly hold the reins. She memorized maps, asked about distant places, and took comfort in the company of hawks and hounds. Her laughter echoed through the royal orchard, and the sound became part of Cintra's daily rhythm, heard even by those who had never seen her, yet knew her presence meant the realm's story would continue. In the village below, mothers spoke her name with hope. Princess Ciri, they said. The kingdom's future had a face, a name, and eyes that watched the world with quiet intensity. Within the citadel, Calanthe remained firm in her path. She balanced the realm's needs with the growing awareness of what Ciri might become. Yet in every action, she emphasized choice. Ciri would live as herself, not as a prophecy wrapped in expectation. The sea tides brushed the cliffs below with their slow and patient rhythm. Ciri stood at the window one morning, her small hands pressed to the cold glass, watching the horizon. She asked no questions that day. She only stared. The Queen, seated nearby, continued reading from an open scroll. Outside, the banners shifted gently in the wind, and the high towers of Cintra remained still. The tale of destiny, once traced quietly in ancient bloodlines and whispered prophecies, took a sharper form on a day remembered less for spectacle and more for its strange symmetry. It was a feast, lavish, spirited, and in every way a gesture of diplomatic courtesy. Cintra's great hall had welcomed many guests over the years, but this particular gathering, held in honor of Pavetta's betrothal long before Ciri's birth, remained etched in court memory as the hour when the law of surprise returned. Among the guests that day was a figure known more by reputation than title. Clad in muted tones and marked by the bearing of a man accustomed to the road rather than the throne, Geralt of Rivia entered the court as a guest, not a rival. He stood apart, neither noble nor servant, neither merchant nor emissary. He was a witcher, and in his eyes was the measured calm of one who had seen too many oaths, too many betrayals, and too many paths end in silence. Calanthe, never one to indulge ceremony for its own sake, welcomed him with a host's restraint. She knew the stories of witches, forged in trials, stripped of certainty, bound to contract and coin. Yet Geralt did not come for coin. He had come to observe a promise fulfilled, a law once spoken, now tangled in something far more complex than anyone had intended. That promise, made when Juni's life had been saved, had been honored. Pavetta and Juni were united. The court had accepted their bond, and time had moved forward. But Geralt had been there during that moment, standing quiet beside chaos. And when asked what reward he desired, he had invoked the law of surprise as tradition allowed. What was owed to him was that which Juni had at home, yet did not know. It was not until later that the meaning became clear. Pavetta was with child. The law of surprise had tethered Geralt to a future he had never sought. It had not been a calculated claim. It had been a reflex, spoken without intention, born of habit more than desire. But destiny had its ways. Years passed before Geralt returned to Cintra. The war drums had not yet sounded, but the kingdom no longer breathed as easily. Rumors drifted northward of Nilfgaard's increasing ambition. The Queen, now older and heavier with the weight of state, greeted him as one whose presence she could not ignore. His presence in the citadel was quiet, yet unmistakable. Calanthe received him in a private chamber, with no scribes and no guards. Their conversation was not one of sentiment. They spoke of Ciri, of destiny, of the law. Geralt asked no favors. He stated what had occurred and what it bound. Calanthe, with eyes sharpened by decades of rule, listened. She did not argue the law, she acknowledged it. Yet her heart, so often held steady through siege and loss, recoiled. She saw in Geralt no threat, only inevitability. But she had raised Ciri as a granddaughter with hopes, talents, and choices. The thought of handing her to a path she had not chosen was something she would not abide, no matter what ancient customs dictated. She offered Geralt gold, hospitality, and the trappings of closure. "Let the law be honored in name alone," she suggested. "Let Ciri remain in her home. Let the Witcher continue his road." Geralt declined none of it, but accepted nothing. He left without raising his voice or seeking counsel. And yet his shadow lingered in the corridors after his departure. Servants spoke of seeing him speak briefly to Mouse Sack. A hawk took flight from the southern tower that morning, circling once before heading inland. Ciri was still a child then. She had heard whispers of destiny, though no one explained them in full. The law of surprise had not been taught in her lessons, though she knew of contracts and ancient codes. She would later recall seeing Geralt that day passing in the orchard. He looked at her once, nodded, and said nothing. What passed between them remained unspoken, but the bond had taken shape. Within the citadel, the conversation changed. Calanthe tightened Ciri's protection, not out of fear, but out of quiet defiance. She would not surrender the child to fate, not to war, not to wandering blades, not even to prophecy. Yet destiny, woven through the law of surprise, had already chosen its threads. Years later, as the drums of Nilfgaard would finally thunder toward the north, the law would return in a different way. Through footsteps across broken roads and choices made without ceremony. Geralt would follow Ciri's trail as a guardian, drawn by bond. And in those final calm years before the sky darkened, the Queen of Cintra sat often in her tower room, the ledger open beside her, the map rolled across the table. Her hand rested on the space marked Erlenwald. Her gaze remained fixed toward the southern pass. The law had been spoken. The child had been born. The wheel had begun to turn. The kingdom of Cintra, long watched by northern peers and admired for its sea-girt strength, awoke one morning to a world that no longer whispered of danger. It spoke it clearly, with purpose and direction. Nilfgaard had declared its intent with motion. Ships appeared where none had docked before. Scouts vanished near the southern roads. And then, in the hush between seasons, the Empire made its position known with clarity no ruler could misread. It began with an incident that seemed at first unrelated. A diplomat en route from Gesso failed to arrive. The trail, tracked by Cintran riders, vanished near the woodlands bordering Nilfgaard's northern outposts. There were signs of a struggle, though little remained. Calanthe received the report without comment, then requested the names of all riders operating near the border that week. The ledger arrived before dusk. Orders followed by nightfall. Then came the assassin. He crossed the river under assumed credentials, cloaked as a minor trader. His route was planned to the hour, his entry point timed with a harvest fair to deflect attention. His target was not the queen, nor a general, but a cartographer, an unassuming scholar tasked with mapping new caravan routes through the lower passes. The man held information about terrain, supply paths, and the structural vulnerabilities of older keeps. The attack was sudden and precise, halted only by coincidence. The scholar survived, but just barely. The would-be killer vanished into the dusk, leaving only a talisman bearing southern script, the emblem etched too carefully to mistake. Calanthe convened her war council 2 days later. The hall was quiet, but alert. Mouse Sack stood near the queen's right hand, his staff unadorned but never far from reach. Iced to Siege, though no longer young, arrived fully armored, his sea-blue mantle drawn high against his collar. Across the table stood Cintra's key officers, men and women drawn for clarity of thought and steadiness of hand. The queen did not ask if war had arrived. She confirmed it. Letters were sent north, to Temeria, Redania, and Cadwyn, not pleading for assistance, but outlining strategic realities. She shared supply estimations, troop positioning, and points of greatest vulnerability. She extended the invitation for mutual defense, though she understood few would answer swiftly. The North, for all its shared borders, often moved with deliberation rather than unity. Within Cintra, mobilization began in earnest. The garrison at Clerdon was reinforced. Grain stores were redistributed along supply lines. Artisans once tasked with ceremonial armor turned their skills to battlefield readiness. The Crown's Wind, Cintra's light cavalry scouts, were expanded and given new directives: observe, report, withdraw. Engagement was forbidden unless circumstances demanded. The docks of Cintra swelled with activity. Shipwrights, long respected but rarely hurried, were pressed into service. Naval vessels were outfitted with reinforced hulls and newer mast structures, allowing for greater maneuverability along the coast. Patrol routes doubled, extending into sectors not charted in recent years. The fleet would not challenge Nilfgaard in open water, but it would ensure the coastline did not sleep. The people of Cintra, ever attuned to the rhythms of their kingdom, sensed the shift. Markets remained open, but trade took on a sharper tone. Coin was exchanged quickly, not leisurely. Clerks worked into the night, processing supply requisitions and updating rosters. Inns filled with travelers heading northward, their questions met with polite silence. In the citadel, Calanthe maintained her public composure. She attended court hours with customary discipline, heard petitions, and confirmed judgments. But behind the outer walls, she planned. She met with Mouse Sack each evening, reviewing magical countermeasures and border wardings. Though Cintra was not known for harboring great magical academies, its ancient cliffs carried ley line traces, energies that, if shaped carefully, could slow or disrupt magical incursions. Protective glyphs were engraved into hidden stones along southern paths. Watchtowers were equipped with enchantments to detect illusion and conjuration. Iced, meanwhile, reorganized the royal guard into mobile platoons. He understood that Nilfgaard would not strike where expected. His scouts were instructed to think like wolves, move quietly, observe tracks, anticipate hunger. No skirmish was too small to investigate. No silence too consistent to trust. The young princess, Cirilla, remained unaware of the full depth of the crisis. Calanthe shielded her where possible, allowing her days to unfold with structured normalcy: lessons, language, riding. But the child noticed the change in tone. Her tutors glanced more often toward the door. Her guards stood closer during walks. And though the orchard still bloomed, fewer birds nested in the upper limbs. One evening, after a series of border encounters resulted in the loss of 2 Cintran scouts, the Queen addressed her commanders in a closed session. She did not speak in raised tones or symbolic gestures. She laid out a clear map, marked with precise locations of Nilfgaardian probes. Her voice was firm, measured. "The Empire does not warn before it strikes," she said. "So we will not wait for ceremony. We hold the line." Preparations deepened. Families were evacuated from outer hamlets. Granaries were sealed. Blacksmiths ceased civilian work. Bells were adjusted for signal use. The city's gates, once opened freely to traders and travelers, now bore stricter watches. The plain of Marnadal stretched like an open palm east of Cintra's heartland, its gently sloping hills dotted with wildflowers and low stone walls that had marked fields for generations. In peacetime, it was a place of trade and travel, a corridor where wagons passed under the soft light of morning and where shepherds tended to grazing flocks. But as the chill of early spring settled over the land and the winds carried unfamiliar cries through the trees, Marnadal became something else entirely, a threshold. Nilfgaard did not arrive with banners unfurled in ceremony, nor did its approach echo through heralds and drums. It came as a coordinated breath, exhaled from the south in long, deliberate movements. Scouts were seen near the Yaruga, then vanished. Caravans that once bore wine and spice now brought figures cloaked in quiet observation. And then, on the 3rd morning of blooming moon, black-clad soldiers were seen crossing the southern bridge in formation, their armor burnished to a dull sheen, their discipline unmistakable. Calanthe had expected this. Her council had reviewed the maps repeatedly, weighing the mountain passes against coastal flanks, considering the Empire's appetite for direct force versus strategic encirclement. Marnadal, open and central, offered both passage and opportunity, and so the Queen deployed her forces there as a stand. The Cintran army, though smaller than Nilfgaard's, moved into position with clarity and resolve. Veterans of skirmishes from the Sodden border held the outer ridges, while newer levies occupied the central lines. Cavalry units remained mobile along the flanks, their orders clear: harass, retreat, redirect. The Queen did not intend to meet the Empire in a single, crushing blow. She intended to buy time. Iced Tuaur Siege rode at the center, his banner stitched with both the Tuaur Siege and Cintran crests. Though born of Skellige blood, he had long since bound himself to the southern realm, and now his command rested not only on loyalty, but on understanding. He had studied Nilfgaard strategies, direct, layered, and often accompanied by magical augmentation. His formation echoed this awareness. Lines were staggered. Communication points doubled. Retreat paths marked. When the first wave of Nilfgaardian infantry crested the rise south of the plain, it did not announce itself. The sound came first, metal moving in rhythm, followed by the low chant of a southern war hymn. Then the crest broke open, and black surged over the hill like a tide. Cintran archers fired early, arcs of flame trailing their arrows. The first ranks fell, but the Empire's formation did not falter. Their response was measured, shields raised in unison, front lines absorbing the brunt, rear lines advancing in silence. Their mags followed from behind, robed in dark crimson, their chants protected by shield-bearers. The clash was sudden and absolute. Swords met shields, horses screamed through the chaos, and the soft hills of Marnadal transformed into shifting lines of motion and resistance. Iced moved among his soldiers without hesitation, directing flanking maneuvers, calling for repositioning, riding hard to where the line wavered most. Above them, on the high ridge near the old watchtower, Calanthe stood beneath the royal standard. She wore no crown, only armor, a cuirass engraved with the Lion of Cintra and a cloak clasped with a silver pin. Her eyes did not leave the field. Every signal was noted, every falter addressed through messengers who galloped down the slope, hooves striking the stone with relentless urgency. 4 hours. The battle churned. Cintran forces repelled the first wave, then the second. Their familiarity with the terrain served them well. Paths hidden by brush, outcrops used as vantage points, rivers used for sudden retreats. Yet Nilfgaard's numbers pressed steadily, their supply chains intact, their formations as unyielding as winter ice. By dusk, the sky turned iron-grey. Smoke drifted over the field, curling through broken pines and the smouldering remains of signal fires. The Cintran line held, but only barely. Reinforcements from the coastal garrisons arrived near twilight, their arrival marked by a low horn echoing across the southern ridge. Calanthe's face, until then unreadable, eased for a moment. Yet even as the reinforcements pressed forward, Nilfgaard adjusted. Their vanguard pulled back briefly, replaced by mounted units, riders trained for open terrain and direct charge. They cut across the field with precision, aiming to fracture, splitting Cintran lines and forcing commanders to redirect precious resources. In the heart of the chaos, Ciri remained far from the field, hidden deep within the forest roots under escort. Calanthe had ordered it herself. She knew the outcome of the battle might decide Cintra's future, but her granddaughter must not be present to witness the kingdom's fate carved into the earth. Instead, a path was prepared, one known only to a select few. If Marnadal could not be held, escape must follow. As night fell, torches lit the field. The fighting, though slowed, did not cease. Cintran archers lit their final arrows, their numbers thinning. Iced, wounded at the shoulder, refused the stretcher offered by his guards. He remained on horseback, issuing final commands. And Calanthe, watching from above, gave the final order. A withdrawal, not retreat, but redirection. The outer regiments were to fall back to the inner hill lines, then move north in stages. The goal was no longer to win, but to preserve what could be carried: the lives, the knowledge, the thread of Cintra's future. The battle did not end that night. It carried into the early hours, marked by scattered engagements and the shuffling of wounded across the darkened plain. By dawn, the fields of Marnadal bore the scars of motion and effort, of defiance held as long as breath allowed. Nilfgaard claimed the field. But they did not break Cintra's spirit. The stand at Marnadal would be remembered as a refusal to yield in silence. A final expression of dignity beneath the weight of inevitable motion. Above the hills, the first light touched the sea. The tide moved in slowly, indifferent and eternal. And where once the banners of Cintra had waved freely over Marnadal's grass, now only the wind passed, carrying the memory of voices that stood for home. By the time the last Cintran units fell back from the plains of Marnadal and the sun dipped low behind the western hills, the Empire no longer advanced cautiously. Nilfgaard moved with certainty, their siege engines creaking along stone-cut paths, their officers issuing orders with measured restraint. What had once been speculation now unfolded as certainty. The southern war machine had turned fully northward, and its eyes were set upon the heart of Cintra itself. The city, built into the cliffs overlooking the sea of the setting sun, was never designed to fall easily. Its walls, reinforced over decades of careful craftsmanship, curved with the natural shape of the land. Narrow roads wound through stone arches and above sheer drops, forcing any approaching force to slow. But walls, however formidable, require defenders. And after the Battle of Marnadal, Cintra's defenders were few, scattered, and weary. Inside the city, Queen Calanthe moved through her court like a figure carved from marble. Her armor, once symbolic, was now worn out of necessity. She spoke little, but her presence alone directed the court. The wounded were sheltered in the lower halls. Provisions were rationed carefully, distributed with precision. Gates were reinforced. Every able-bodied guard, sailor, or craftsman was conscripted for city defense. Even scribes took to sharpening weapons when their ink dried. The people of Cintra, long familiar with the Queen's iron resolve, mirrored her calm. Fear lived in the corners, in the hurried glances, the shuffling feet, but it did not rule them. Families gathered in the inner courts, cooking over shared fires. Old songs were whispered to children as comfort. The city did not scream. It braced. Nilfgaard's army reached the outer range of the city on the second day following Marnadal. Their camp, assembled with ruthless efficiency, stretched far along the lower slopes, tents arranged like black scales across the land. There were no overt displays, no grand declarations, only motion, deliberate, ordered, and unwavering. Calanthe summoned her commanders one final time. Among them stood Mousesack, still cloaked in sea grey, his staff etched with quiet runes. Though the druid offered no grand spells to turn the tide, he advised with clarity. Defensive wards were reinforced. A barrier circle was traced around the royal wing, designed to obscure. The Queen issued her final instructions in a voice that carried through the stone walls. Civilians were to be moved through hidden corridors beneath the citadel, ancient tunnels carved for times of siege, leading to the forested routes toward the Jaruga. The route was long and dangerous, but it remained the only hope for survival. Among those tasked with leading the escape was a small party of royal guards, 2 trusted scouts, and a single druid sworn to secrecy. At the center of the plan stood Cirilla. The princess, though still a child, sensed the weight of the moment. Calanthe did not lie to her. She knelt beside her granddaughter in the Queen's antechamber, took her hand, and spoke of love. She explained that the city might fall, that roads ahead would not be easy, but that her blood carried strength drawn not only from mags and kings, but from the people who built ships, who gathered grain, who held fast when others fled. "You must survive," she said. "Not because of destiny, because of Cintra." That night, the city of Cintra prepared for siege. Fires were kept low. Signals were arranged in lantern code. The garrison formed its final line along the outer wall. Archers stationed themselves in windows once used to overlook festivals. And in the deep hours before dawn, the empire moved. The siege began with precision. Siege ladders, iron-tipped, pressed against stone. Archers loosed volleys. A small section of the wall cracked by mid-morning, its base weakened by underground sappers. The breach did not collapse, but it groaned with strain. Within the royal wing, the escape plan commenced. Ciri, dressed in travel leathers, was led through the lower halls. The stone corridor opened beneath the tapestry of the founding kings. She looked back only once, toward the high hall where her grandmother had watched over the realm for so many years. Mouse Sack gave her a soft nudge forward. The door closed. On the upper levels, Calanthe remained. She stood in the western chamber overlooking the sea, her sword beside her, her armor clasped without assistance. Mouse Sack had offered a means to flee. She declined. The Queen of Cintra would not leave her post. She would not be captured. She would not become a token in Nilfgaard's game. As Nilfgaardian forces pressed into the upper ring, Calanthe issued her last command. A white banner was not raised. There would be no surrender. When the soldiers breached the final gate, they found the court empty, the royal chamber dark. The Queen's throne stood vacant. Her final act had already passed into the stones. Cintra fell before the fourth night. Nilfgaard claimed it swiftly, its officers mapping the city with military clarity. But what they found was not submission. It was a wound they would never fully close. The city had endured until it could endure no more. And out beyond the city walls, deep within the whispering woods, a child ran beneath branches lit by stars, her path unmarked, her name unspoken, but her blood carrying all that remained of a kingdom now silent. In the woods east of the Yaruga, where the trees grew close together and the canopy filtered the moonlight into scattered patches across the forest floor, a small group moved with measured urgency. The path they followed was traced in memory, charted by those who had kept Cintra's old maps tucked away beneath royal archives and monastery vaults, passed down in fragments, remembered by those who knew that when the tide of war finally swept through the city, not all would remain. Among them was Cirilla, Ciri, no longer the princess of public ceremonies or the curious child of courtly life, but a figure clad in worn leather, her boots too large, her cloak smelling of wood smoke and dried herbs. The soldiers who accompanied her had once stood at attention beneath banners of silk and gold, but now they moved through shadows, their armor patched with wool, their voices kept low. They no longer bore the livery of a court. They moved like wolves who had once known houses. Prince Dara, not of royal birth but given the title by circumstance and camaraderie, was among them, a quiet, sharp-eyed boy who had joined the company during the early days of evacuation. His understanding of the land, born of time spent in the outer provinces and his elven bloodline, proved more useful than any title. He moved confidently along the uneven terrain, pausing only to listen when the wind shifted or birds fell silent. He did not speak often, but when he did, the others listened. The group traveled in short bursts, pausing often to recheck their bearings, gathering in clusters beneath dense branches or behind the old waystones that marked forgotten shrines. They avoided open fields. The rivers were crossed at night. Their fires, when lit, were hidden within pits dug quickly and filled with smoldering bark. Food was rationed tightly. Every step northward was measured against the risks that came with exposure. Nilfgaardian scouts had begun spreading beyond the city days after its fall. The empire did not merely conquer by force. It tracked, it hunted, it catalogued. Ciri spoke little during those days. The loss of Cintra lay heavy in her chest. She had not seen the moment her grandmother stood for the last time. She had not heard the cries from the western gate or watched the black flags rise above the citadel. But she felt the absence like cold air against her bones. Every tree, every silence between footfalls, echoed what was no longer there. She remembered the orchard where she used to climb. The way the stone tiles of the western courtyard warmed beneath the summer sun. The scent of the library, old parchment and mountain thyme, and the way Calanthe's fingers always seemed to brush against the map table when she paused in thought. These fragments flickered in her mind as anchors. They kept her steady as the group moved farther into unfamiliar woods, where the landscape grew wilder and less forgiving. One evening, as the moonlight broke through the branches and the camp was assembled beneath a moss-covered cliff, one of the soldiers shared a quiet tale. He had served under Iced, had fought at Marnadal, had been pulled from the field when the line collapsed. He spoke of the way the Cintran banners refused to fall even when the ground gave way. He described how Iced held the center line with blooded hands, issuing orders through the smoke, never looking away from the front. His words were not loud. They did not rouse cheers. But for Ciri, they landed like stone placed upon stone. Another part of the wall rebuilt, if only in memory. Dara, seated nearby, said nothing. But when the soldier finished, he passed Ciri a small branch, stripped of leaves, its bark carved with a quiet symbol, a lion. She held it for a long while, then tucked it into her satchel. The further they traveled, the more the terrain changed. The southern hills gave way to marshes, then high forest, where roots tangled beneath shallow soil and mist pooled near fallen logs. They crossed briefly into abandoned hamlets, the buildings still intact but eerily silent. In one village, they found a well stocked with supplies, grain, salted fish, even folded linens. No sign of the inhabitants remained. They took only what was needed, leaving a carved stone in thanks, as was tradition. Rumors drifted northward faster than armies. The group heard scattered reports from traveling merchants and old women who lingered near shrines. Entire families were moving inland, avoiding main roads. Some claimed Nilfgaard would continue past Cintra, sweeping up into Temeria and beyond. Others spoke of allied resistance forming near Sodden Hill. A few whispered of mags gathering in secret conclaves. The continent was shifting beneath everyone's feet, and no one knew where the new lines would hold. For Ciri, the journey became less about arrival and more about motion. As long as they moved, there was purpose. As long as they survived each day, there was still something to protect. She trained with wooden blades when the guards permitted, learning how to move her weight, how to fall without breaking a limb. Dara showed her how to listen to the woods, how to mark the shift in birdsong that preceded a patrol, how to taste bark to check for poisons. Each night, she dreamed of shapes she could not fully describe. Silver towers in mist, a woman with raven hair who stood beside fire, and a white wolf moving across snow, its gaze fixed forward. These dreams left her waking with a strange clarity, her breathing steady, her pulse calm. Eventually, the group reached the foothills bordering Sodden. From here the journey would become more dangerous. The war front shifted daily. Paths once open were now patrolled. Yet within those hills lay something else, a direction that would lead, eventually, to destiny. Ciri stood one morning at the edge of a ridge, the sun rising behind her. Below, the forest stretched like a green sea, mist curling along its surface. Dara stood beside her, silent. She did not ask when they would stop running. She understood, now, that survival was not a pause between chapters. It was the chapter itself. Beyond the foothills of Sodden, where the paths narrowed and the land bore the scars of recent movement, the world no longer resembled the kingdom Ciri had once known. Fields were torn by wagon tracks that led nowhere. Campfires flickered in groves where no towns had ever stood. Voices carried through trees in unfamiliar dialects, and smoke drifted constantly along the horizon, never quite rising, never quite fading. It was here, among these scattered lives and makeshift shelters, that Ciri came to understand the full breadth of the loss. The camp was a place that had formed through necessity. Families had arrived in waves, carrying little more than blankets and bundles of bread. Some brought mules, others pushed wheelbarrows or dragged carts until their wheels splintered. They built tents from canvas, dug shallow trenches to divert rainwater, and marked paths with pieces of cloth tied to trees. There was no lord here, no commander, only a shared understanding. The roads behind them were gone, and the ones ahead remained uncertain. Ciri's arrival, though quiet, did not go unnoticed. The guards traveling with her tried to blend into the periphery, but their weapons and posture made it clear they were more than simple travelers. Rumors passed quickly through the camp. Some whispered that she was a noble child, others believed her to be a lost mage's ward. A few spoke of her hair, the pale shade reminiscent of snow on the Yaruga cliffs, and drew their own conclusions. None of them knew the truth in full, but all of them sensed she carried weight far beyond her years. The camp's rhythms were slow and purposeful. Each morning began with the search for water. Buckets were passed along lines, and those strong enough ventured farther into the woods to find clean sources. Food was rationed: roots, dried fruit, stale bread soaked in broth. A traveling herbalist offered bark tea for coin, though most paid with favors instead. A pair of Nilfgaardian deserters, stripped of their insignias, worked near the edge of the camp preparing boots and sharpening tools. No one asked where they had come from. No one asked why they stayed. Ciri was given a place to sleep beneath a canvas lean-to supported by 2 bent branches. Dara remained close by, sharing firewatch duties and helping forage when the supplies ran low. The guards who had once marched with the Cintran court slowly took on the role of protectors. They watched the perimeter, offered advice on defensive lines, and taught knife handling to young men and women who had never before lifted a blade. In the evenings, Ciri sat near the central fire, her cloak drawn close, listening to stories told by those who had fled before her. An old woman from Vengerberg spoke of the day the skies turned gold and strange figures passed overhead, their eyes like glass and voices like wind. A boy from Bruges remembered crossing a river at night. The bridge behind him set alight by figures he never saw again. A trader, once wealthy, now barefoot, recalled the sound of hooves echoing across stone just before his warehouse fell silent. These stories did not frighten her. They added shape to the world she had now entered, one not defined by castles or inheritance, but by survival. She learned to listen closely to each tale, picking out the moments when hope emerged like green shoots through ash. She watched how some held onto relics, a locket, a carved spoon, a cloth with a crest long faded, and how others had already let go, moving forward with hands empty but eyes steady. One day, as the sun passed low through the trees, casting long amber lines across the ground, a skirmish broke out along the camp's western edge. A band of scavengers, driven by hunger or desperation, attempted to breach the perimeter. There were no war cries, no banners, only the sound of branches breaking and shouts muffled by cloth-wrapped faces. The Cintran guards responded quickly, forming a line and forcing the attackers back with practiced calm. It was over within minutes, but the message remained. Ciri, watching from behind the herbalist's wagon, felt the tension ripple through the camp. People spoke in hushed tones that evening. They ate quickly, kept their fires low. A sense of exposure settled in, as though the forest had grown thinner. The next day, a decision was made to move. Word spread through the camp that the group would head east, toward a trade route said to still carry supplies between Mahakam and Hengfors. It was a gamble, but one that offered a thread of direction. Ciri did not question the plan. She packed her things, checked her satchel, and waited. Before they departed, she walked once more through the camp. She passed the herbalist's lean-to, the stone circle where stories had been told, the tree where a child had hung carved wooden birds from its lower branches. She paused there, running her fingers across the bark. Then she turned and followed Dara into the growing line of travelers. The forest closed behind them. They moved for days, then weeks. Some departed along the way, pulled toward rumors of safer havens or old homesteads left behind. New faces joined, merchants, healers, even a bard who sang softly to himself when the fire cracked. Each person brought something, even if only a name spoken aloud. Each one watched the road ahead. At night, when the fires burned low and the forest stirred with its own life, she sometimes woke to the sound of wind shifting through high branches. She would lie still, her breath even, her hand on the carved lion branch Dara had given her. Across the breadth of the continent, where trails weaved into one another like old threads in a faded tapestry, Geralt of Rivia rode in silence. His horse, Roach, moved with a rhythm that needed no prompting, accustomed to the stillness that followed its rider like a second cloak. The Witcher bore no royal emblem, no scroll of intent, no destination fixed by a sovereign's hand. But the path beneath him had begun long ago, and it now led steadily, unavoidably, toward the south. Word of Cintra's fall had reached him through the subtle ways that travelers whispered when firelight grew thin. Inns fell quiet when certain names were mentioned. Caravans changed course without reason. Trade routes, once sure and open, became winding and uncertain. Where once banners had risen proudly above the stone walls of a southern kingdom, only smoke and shadows now remained. Geralt had passed through the outskirts of Bruges when the first clear signs began to show. Refugees moving northward, their faces drawn and tired, their carts nearly empty. He did not ask questions. He did not need to. He had walked through enough ruins in his time to recognize the shape of despair. Yet beneath that familiar scent of ash and loss was something else. A thread, barely perceptible, tied to an old promise. The law of surprise had bound him to Cintra in ways he had not anticipated. When first spoken, it had been a matter of custom, a tradition more ancient than most laws etched into royal tablets. He had claimed nothing with intention. Yet what followed had been set into motion beyond his reach. Cirilla, Ciri, had been marked by it. And though he had walked away from the court once, now his path turned back. He approached Cintra not as a rescuer, nor as a warrior, but as one seeking to find what remained. The city itself had changed. Its outer fields, once busy with traders and stewards, now stood silent. Walls bore the dark marks of siege. The air tasted of old smoke. Geralt entered through the lower passage, once used by delivery carts, now choked with rubble. He moved through the broken remains of homes, the market square half collapsed, the fountain dry. Within the citadel, time had paused. Tables stood with cups unemptied. Windows, shattered by force or weather, let in birdsong through silence. He did not linger. He passed through the chambers, the halls, the upper court, and finally, the throne room. Here where Calanthe had once commanded with a voice that filled stone and soul alike, now only dust and scattered papers remained. No crown lay forgotten. No final message carved into the walls. Only the absence of presence. It was a conclusion. Geralt stood for a time before the high chair, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his blade. He thought not of politics, nor prophecy. He thought of the girl he had once seen walking beside a white-haired woman on the orchard path, her small hands gathering apple blossoms in her sleeves. He thought of her laughter, sharp and sudden, and he wondered if that voice still rang somewhere beyond these broken walls. He did not find her there, but the trail had not gone cold. Reports had reached him from scouts near Sodden, of a girl traveling with a small group of guards who did not wear Nilfgaardian black, of someone speaking Cintran with the quiet cadence of the southern coast. He gathered what he could, fragments, overheard remarks, sketches left behind in tables. Nothing certain. Everything pointed forward. Along the trail, he encountered others, travelers, lost merchants, wandering minstrels, each of whom told a different version of the same tale. Some spoke of a child blessed by fortune, saved by druids. Others believed her to be a mage's ward, protected by northern powers. Few knew her name, but Geralt recognized the pattern. She had survived. That much he no longer doubted. He moved steadily, unhurried, never wasting time, but never rushing either. The forest paths between Cintra and the lower reaches of Sodden were treacherous, shaped by the movement of armies and the reshaping of the land itself. Where once bridges stood, now only ropes remained. Villages once marked on maps were reduced to ash, or worse, emptied without sign. One afternoon, near the ruins of a watchtower long fallen into moss, he found remnants of a campfire. The coals had long since cooled, but near the edge of the clearing lay a stone etched with the outline of a lion. It was not a soldier's mark. It was personal. The kind of thing carved by someone trying to remember, or hold on. He knelt beside it for a long moment. Then he stood, and continued eastward. Ciri's path had become part of the land now. He followed not just her trail, but the ripple of her presence. She had moved through these places like a quiet wind, unnoticed at first, but impossible to forget once past. And wherever she was now, she was no longer simply fleeing. She was finding her way. When the banners of Nilfgaard were raised above the broken stones of Cintra's citadel, the northern kingdoms did not respond in unison. Their reactions came in waves, some measured, others desperate, none untouched by the tremor that had just split the balance of the continent. The fall of Cintra had not merely claimed a kingdom. It had opened a wound across the political map, one whose edges bled into every court and council chamber from Edern to Cadwyn. In Temeria, the court of King Foltest convened behind closed doors. Envoys arrived from Redania with questions that sounded like demands. Spies passed each other beneath tavern tables in Vizima, trading news of troop movements and whispered alliances. No one spoke aloud of retaliation. 4 decades, the northern kingdoms had operated in parallel, loosely aligned through treaties and traditions, but more often preoccupied with their own boundaries. Temeria guarded its mines, Cadwyn its forests, Redania its trade routes. The fall of a southern state had once seemed a distant possibility, regrettable, perhaps, but not urgent. But Cintra's fall had changed that. The reports that filtered north painted a picture more thorough than any expected. Nilfgaard had not raised the kingdom in fire and spectacle. It had occupied with efficiency, securing roads, installing governors, and integrating the region into its broader structure. Resistance had been expected, and prepared for. Within weeks, supply lines flowed southward. New banners flew above tax halls. The old names were kept in public spaces as a means of placation. And yet beneath this ordered surface, something else stirred. In the forests bordering Dol Blythana, bands of non-humans began to gather, in silence, moving through woods without torches, communicating through signs and symbols left on trees. Many had lost their homes in the early Nilfgaardian advances. Others had seen Cintra's chaos as a signal that the world was shifting, that new allegiances must be forged beyond human thrones. The Scoia'tael, squirrels, as they would later be mockingly called, did not yet bear the name. But their motion had begun. Refugees from Cintra and its surrounding provinces poured into northern villages, often greeted with wary hospitality. Some were offered food and shelter, others viewed as burdens. Tensions flared in border towns as resources strained. Grain shipments were intercepted. Roads once safe became risky. Banditry rose, often masked in the language of justice. They were Nilfgaardian sympathizers, some said. They brought the war with them, said others. The northern kings began to meet more frequently, first through letters, then in person. Secret gatherings took place near Sodden Hill, in the ruined towers left from the last great conflict. There, strategy was discussed in whispers. Lines were drawn in the minds of those who would eventually have to stand or flee. Amid this growing uncertainty, a few voices called for unity. Sorcerers, long distant from the courts unless summoned, now found themselves in demand. Letters bearing the seal of Arethusa arrived at distant fortresses. Rectors and rectresses spoke of stability, of magical coordination, of the need for a guiding hand. And among them, whispers began to spread of a girl, hidden, marked, pursued. Not merely royal. Tied to something older. Some believed her to be a lost heir. Others called her a key. But all agreed on one thing. Wherever Cirilla of Cintra had gone, her presence now lingered at the edge of everything. In the city of Oxenfurt, scholars gathered what maps remained. Political cartographers began updating territory charts with cautious ink, drawing new lines where Nilfgaard now stood. Academics debated the future. Some claimed the empire's advance could be slowed through diplomacy. Others warned that what had begun with Cintra would not end there. At the same time, border keeps along the Mahakam foothills doubled their guards. Horns were tested. Watchfires were kept lit even on clear nights. Every noise in the woods was noted. The fear was not of armies marching en masse, but of small things. Agents, whispers, movements just beyond the torches. Amidst all of this, Geralt continued his quiet journey. He passed through towns more alert than before, watched by guards whose spears lowered more quickly than they had in years past. He crossed bridges where tolls had doubled, asked questions in marketplaces where eyes flicked nervously at southern travelers. The world had tightened. Curiosity had become suspicion. Still, he moved forward. He saw the aftermath of war in its true form, not in craters or ruins, but in hesitation. In the way a blacksmith's hammer paused when a stranger passed. In the way a mother pulled her child closer near the well. In how old alliances were suddenly measured by convenience, not trust. In this new northern reality, Cintra was no longer just a fallen kingdom. It had become a symbol of loss, of warning, of what could come next. And through it all, beneath politics and patrols, stories spread of a white-haired girl in muddy boots who walked through refugee lines with her eyes open. A child of ruin. A spark in the dark. The North had not yet decided how to respond, but it had awakened. While kings deliberated and soldiers regrouped, another current stirred across the continent, less visible than swords or banners, but just as potent. It flowed through marble halls and ivy-covered towers, across candlelit tables where runes were studied beside reports of war. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers, long self-governed and politically aloof, found itself drawn from the margins and into the storm that followed Cintra's collapse. Its members, spread across various courts and independent enclaves, felt the tremor not only in the loss of a kingdom but in the shift of power and prophecy tied to its name. At Arethusa, the Grand Academy on the Ned Island, discussion turned sharp. The fall of Cintra had shaken magical continuity. Mags tied to royal patrons were recalled to the conclave. Scrolls were unsealed. Prophecies once studied for form now gained practical weight. Among them, one name emerged repeatedly, spoken in the calm, reserved tones of those who knew its gravity: Cirilla. It was not only the law of surprise that bound her to significance. It was what she carried, an inheritance far older than crowns. Elder blood. The gift, or burden, of Lara Doran's line. Scholars disagreed on the degree of its activation, whether it had yet awoken fully in the girl, or whether it slumbered still, awaiting a catalyst. But none doubted that if she lived, she would become central to what came next. Yennefer of Vengerberg, though not yet a central figure in the Brotherhood's politics, had begun her own inquiries. Her loyalties were not easily claimed, neither by crowns nor councils. But she sensed, through quiet channels and cryptic messages, that something crucial had been set in motion. She did not move openly. She never did. But she listened, she observed, and when she spoke, it was to those who understood the stakes without needing to ask. Elsewhere, in chambers less lit by reason, another figure emerged with sharp purpose: Vilgefortz. A sorcerer of considerable skill and growing ambition, he had long observed the fractures within the Brotherhood with a calculating eye. The fall of Cintra, for him, was an opportunity. In letters exchanged with select allies, he outlined a vision of centralized magical authority, one that would not merely respond to the whims of kings, but direct the shape of the continent itself. Not all within the magical order agreed with this ambition. Tisaya de Vries, Archmistress of Aretusa, advocated restraint and preservation of the order's independence. She warned against entangling magic too closely with the coming war. But her voice, while respected, found less traction than before. War had a way of pushing theory into action. Amid these divisions, a conclave was proposed, neutral ground, a gathering to assess the state of magic and its place in the shifting world. Invitations were sent to mags from all kingdoms, though some were intercepted. Not all intended to attend in good faith. Magical politics was rarely about open confrontation. It was woven through suggestions, positioning, and the slow, steady shaping of events. But now, with Nilfgaard ascending and the northern courts distracted, the Brotherhood stood at a crossroads. Would it remain an advisory circle, guiding from the edges? Or would it become a pillar of the new order? Beneath these questions, another concern lingered: the thinning of magical anchors. In the weeks following Cintra's fall, ley lines around the Yaruga region shifted. Minor anomalies were recorded: teleportation failures, spell echoes, mirror anomalies. Some believed these were side effects of the Nilfgaardian advance, others blamed unstable magical relics unearthed during the siege. But a few whispered that it was something older, something awakening. The search for Ciri became more than a political pursuit. It became magical necessity. Her bloodline was no mere curiosity. It was a potential key to ancient forces. And whether she remained hidden among refugees or had already fallen into someone's hands, her existence was now a matter of great consequence. Not all who sought her did so with kindness. Agents moved through cities and villages, asking quiet questions, offering coin for sightings of a white-haired girl traveling north. Some were sorcerers. Others were not. But they shared one trait: they all looked as though they listened more than they spoke. Back in Aretusa, the tone of discussion changed. No longer focused on potential, the Brotherhood began drafting responses. Safeguard protocols, relocation plans, contingency spells. A new class of students was trained in magical restraint and battlefield conduct. War was no longer something to be avoided. It was something to be prepared for. And still, the girl moved somewhere beyond their reach, her path twisting through forests and rivers, guided by instinct. Geralt, too, felt the change. He had passed through villages where magical residue lingered like fog, places where the wind carried whispers and reflections lingered longer than they should. He knew the signs. Something was stirring beneath the surface of the world. He did not chase prophecy, but he knew when it followed him. The roads that wove through the continent were more than mere connections between cities. They carried stories in their dust, of merchants, of fugitives, of wanderers too tired to speak their names aloud. And now, among them, moved a girl with ash-blonde hair and emerald eyes, whose path by unfolding necessity. Ciri no longer journeyed as a princess. Her clothes bore the stains of bark and soot. Her boots were scuffed from river stone. Yet her bearing remained unmistakable. She moved with the quiet urgency of someone learning to read the land. The forests of Lower Sodden gave way to winding riverbanks, where reeds brushed against worn leather and frogs chirped in patient rhythm. She followed waterways for days at a time, trusting them more than any mapped road. Villages were avoided unless absolutely necessary. Even those sympathetic to the northern cause could be unpredictable. Starvation made good people cautious. Suspicion lived easily in their eyes. Among the few who offered shelter were old women with sharp fingers and sharper eyes. One gave her broth, saying nothing but watching closely. Another provided a satchel of dried fruit in exchange for silence and a moment's stillness. It was in these small exchanges that Ciri began to understand something deeper. Survival was a shared language. And for those who had endured, be they peasant, hedge mage, or tinker, there was no need to explain who she was. They knew she was moving forward. That was enough. Over time, she learned to measure the day by the sound of birds, by the way deer moved between shadows, by the scent of pine on cold mornings. Dara remained with her for a while longer, their companionship bound not by formality, but by familiarity. He taught her to listen for the snapping of dry twigs when wind was still, to identify moss directions on tree trunks, and how to mimic the call of a thrush's signal. But eventually, their paths diverged. There was no quarrel, no grand farewell. Only a moment beside a ruined waystone, where Dara looked southward and spoke quietly of things he needed to find, of elven elders and stories not told in northern tongues. Ciri nodded, understanding that not all paths could remain entwined. They embraced only briefly. When she turned away, she did not look back. She respected the silence as a form of trust. Her journey continued westward, through wind-worn hills and broken fort roads where moss grew thick in cracks once patrolled by Cintran scouts. She crossed rivers using old ferry ropes, sometimes hitching rides with wandering traders who didn't ask too many questions. One such man, a mute with kind eyes and a twisted back, offered her bread and warm tea without expecting payment. He communicated with gestures alone, and when they parted, he pressed a woven charm into her hand, an old luck ward tied with black thread. Ciri kept it tied to her satchel. Some nights, she slept beneath stars, blanketed by pine needles. Other times, she huddled in abandoned farmhouses, listening to owls move across rafters. Occasionally, her dreams shifted from memory to something stranger, visions not of Cintra or its fall, but of places she had never seen. A tower standing over white cliffs, its top wrapped in storm clouds. A woman with violet eyes calling her name from across a sea of mirrors. A battlefield covered in snow, where flame danced beneath ice. These dreams left her breathless upon waking, but they did not frighten her. They felt like messages, though their meaning remained veiled. Her travels brought her eventually to the edge of the Yaruga's northern tributaries, where boats could sometimes be found moored in secrecy, guided by those who avoided open roads. Among such ferrymen was an old dwarf named Jorik, who ferried coin, letters, and occasionally fugitives across the river under cover of fog. He agreed to take her only after she recited a phrase passed quietly through resistance cells: "The lion sleeps, but the roots still grow." Jorik raised an eyebrow, then nodded. His boat was small but sturdy, its hull patched with careful hands. As they crossed, he shared no stories, but hummed old dwarven laments under his breath, the sound vibrating through the wood like low thunder. On the far bank, Ciri stepped onto a new shore. Behind her lay months of motion, of shadowed glances, of near misses and narrow paths. Ahead, the land opened differently, flatter, more windswept, where the soil darkened with clay and the trees bowed eastward as if leaning into history itself. It was here she first heard the rumors, of Scoia'tael rising in the forests beyond the foothills, of Nilfgaardian detachments clashing with local lords, of strange beasts haunting the lower passes, monsters twisted not by nature but by something deeper. And always, beneath these tales, echoes of a girl, a survivor of Cintra, traveling alone, seen once and then gone again like mist before dawn. Ciri did not deny these stories. She simply kept moving. She met a seer in a stone circle hamlet who touched her hand and spoke of worlds that bleed together. A smith's wife in Verdun offered her shelter in exchange for tending goats and cleaning cinders. In her silence and work, Ciri found something familiar, something grounding. It was rhythm, and for a time, it helped. But the road always called again. When she departed from the small cottage, she left behind a carved wooden lion, etched into the base of the doorframe. By now, The girl who had fled the fall of Cintra no longer walked as one chased. She walked as one drawn forward, not to reclaim what was lost, but to understand what remained. In the distance, always, was the pulse of something older than war. Something waiting. Long after the banners had been pulled down, and long after the walls had crumbled into lichen-covered stone, Queen Calanthe of Cintra remained present, not in form, but in recollection. Her name lived in the echoes of old ballads, in the precise way courtiers pronounced Cintra's name, and in the careful silence that followed any mention of her final days. Across the continent, in courts and cabins alike, the Lioness of Cintra had become more than a sovereign. She had become a story, both shield and mirror to a kingdom that no longer stood. In the northern provinces, minstrels began weaving her legend into verses sung by firelight. They sang of her youth, her campaigns, her silver-fletched arrows, and the stormy days when she faced down emissaries with only a glance. Some versions embellished, adding giants or firestorms, but the core remained untouched. Calanthe had stood firm when others might have bowed, and in doing so, had left behind a legacy stitched into the fabric of the northern kingdoms. Among witches and travelers, her name was often paired with respect rather than sentiment. Many still remembered the feast recounted in the tale A Question of Price, where Queen Calanthe had invited lords, magicians, and wandering swordsmen into her hall beneath the guise of finding a suitor for her daughter. Those who recounted the story often did so with a low voice and measured cadence, for what began as courtly tradition had revealed itself to be something far deeper. It was that night, in the corridors of Cintra's old stone keep, where destiny had spoken, and where the law of surprise had become more than a custom. The Witcher Geralt, then a quiet presence at the edge of ceremony, had walked away from that night with more than he realized. He had not claimed a prize. He had been given a bond, one that now shaped his path across a broken realm. In the years that followed, when other witches passed through Redania or Temeria, they would hear whispers of a white-haired girl, always tied somehow to the woman whose command once filled the great hall of Cintra like rolling thunder. Calanthe's presence also remained in policy and in fear. The Nilfgaardian governors, though they ruled from her throne, made careful effort not to erase her image entirely. Statues were not torn down. Reliefs remained intact. Her likeness, carved into the main square's fountain, was left untouched. Some claimed it was pragmatism, an attempt to pacify a restive population. Others believed it was superstition, that even the empire, in its might, dared not anger the memory of a ruler who had looked an empire in the eye and refused to yield. In private chambers, however, her legacy was parsed with greater nuance. Diplomats debated whether Calanthe's refusal to submit had doomed her people or granted them the dignity of resistance. Philosophers argued over whether her rule had built a foundation too strong for Nilfgaard to fully dismantle. And students at Oxenfurt occasionally penned theses on the nature of her leadership, often titled with phrases like "the last monarch of flame or roar beneath the throne." Yet beyond scholarship and song, it was in the memories of her people that Calanthe endured most clearly. The elders who had watched her ride through the streets spoke of how she smiled when children approached her steed, of the way she personally greeted returning hunters after lean winters, of how she sat beside widows during funeral rites without expectation of record or praise. These stories were not grand, but they were true, and in their telling, her rule gained dimension not always captured in tapestry or scroll. Among the survivors scattered across the north, her name was often spoken as comfort. In refugee circles, where food was shared in silence and sleep came fitfully, it was common to hear parents tell children, "Calanthe would have stood," or "the Queen watches still." These phrases carried no magic, but they offered steadiness. They reminded the dislocated that their identity had not vanished with the city. It had followed them, carried in will. In the darker corners of the continent, her legend took a sharper form. To Nilfgaardian soldiers who occupied former Cintran territory, she was sometimes spoken of in wary tones. "Watch for the Lioness," they muttered when patrols entered groves where locals had recently vanished. It was not that they feared a ghost. It was that they knew memory could rouse resistance faster than orders could quell it. And for Ciri, moving still through forest and town, her grandmother's memory was her compass, a reminder of roots. When she struggled to sleep, when decisions pressed too heavily upon her, she would recall the weight of Calanthe's hand on her shoulder, the scent of worn leather and lavender, the steady tone of her voice. That memory stayed with her more vividly than any prophecy. She did not chase the past, but she carried it. The Lioness of Cintra had not fallen with her walls. She had passed into legend, into the firmament of northern stories where the stars bore names of rulers who had lived and led with flame in their gaze. In the wake of Cintra's fall, the question of who would claim the seat left empty did not fade quietly. Even as Nilfgaard fortified its hold and planted governors to administer the region in the name of the emperor, the northern kingdoms regarded the matter as far from settled. Cintra's throne, empty though it was, remained symbolically charged. It represented more than territory. It carried the weight of memory, legitimacy, and ancestral pride. And across the halls of Redania, Temeria, Edirne, and even the free cities of the north, the matter of succession, however theoretical, began to brew with subtle intensity. Redania, ever calculating, positioned itself early. King Visimir's advisors circulated quiet missives asserting that Cintra had historically shared bloodlines with Redanian nobility. Though the ties were distant, thread-thin and years removed, they were enough for the scribes to draw up documents marked with elaborate seals and family trees. These records were not shouted from balconies. They were whispered through embassies, brought into banquets tucked between other papers, raised as casual possibilities in otherwise casual conversations. Of course, a Redanian envoy might say, the lineage bears examination. Temeria, in contrast, took a more pragmatic stance. King Foltest remained publicly uncommitted, but his ministers understood the stakes. Control over Cintra's southern roads meant access to trade and proximity to Skellige routes. A foothold, even symbolic, would give Temeria leverage in negotiations that extended far beyond the south. And so, through a mixture of military overtures and veiled diplomacy, Temerian agents began to move quietly into adjacent border towns, offering protection, rebuilding charters, sponsoring granaries under banners of goodwill. Nilfgaard, of course, held the city in fact. Its soldiers walked Cintra streets. Its currency replaced local coin. But the Empire understood the power of perception. Rather than erase Cintra's identity outright, Nilfgaard sought to reshape it. Statues were cleaned, not toppled. Public ceremonies invoked the old names. The Empire positioned itself as steward, not conqueror, at least in its proclamations. Cintra remains Cintran, declared a Nilfgaardian emissary in Gorsvelen, only now with purpose aligned to the greater harmony of the South. It was theatre, of course, but it was theatre with intent. Beyond the political houses, the free cities watched with equal parts concern and calculation. Novigrad, long a place of coin and contract rather than crown, saw opportunity in the chaos. Merchant lords quietly funded expeditions into Cintra's ruins, recovering artifacts, maps, and trade ledgers. A few even floated the notion of purchasing estates, ancient holdings now legally ambiguous. The city's banks prepared loan structures for displaced nobles seeking to reclaim property, with interest rates set just high enough to ensure long-term dependency. Amid all this posturing, one name lingered quietly in the background: Cirilla Fiona Ellen Rhiannon. The girl had vanished, slipped through the wreckage, eluding both Nilfgaardian patrols and northern agents alike. But she remained the rightful heir. Even those who doubted the old ways could not ignore the bloodline. And though no court declared open support for her return, many kept ears to the ground. Should she re-emerge, alive, unclaimed, unbroken, her presence would upend the balance entirely. Redanian scholars prepared drafts of legal recognition, contingent upon her appearance. Temerian envoys kept blank scrolls ready, awaiting a seal. Even Skellige, whose ties to Cintra ran deeper than most assumed, began to whisper of restoration. Queen Calanthe had once considered a union with Skellige's ruling house. Some claimed she had even blessed such an alliance in secret. If Ciri were to appear on Skellige's shores, she would not be turned away. But the political rivalry over Cintra's seat did not remain in words alone. Along the edges of its former borders, patrols began to overlap. Skirmishes flared between northern scouts and Nilfgaardian supply lines. Diplomats denied knowledge. Bandits, they claimed. Mistaken identity. But the truth was clear to any observer. Cintra had become a fulcrum, and no side wished to let the other tip the balance. In Oxenfurt, historians revised their lectures, updating maps with dotted lines and speculative claims. In private chambers, arcane advisors debated whether Ciri's emergence would bind her to the fate of the realm, or doom her to be used by those who sought only advantage. Her name, spoken softly, moved faster than coin. She had become a symbol of possibility. Among the common folk, this rivalry over the Cintran seat appeared distant, almost abstract. But they felt its effects in more immediate ways: food prices fluctuating, garrison expansions in towns once peaceful, rumors of spies in the markets. To them, Cintra had become a shadow that stretched across the fields. One no longer ruled, but never truly absent. In hushed corners of inns and near caravan fires, veterans spoke of Calanthe and the pride she once inspired. They spoke, too, of what might return if the right heir stood once more. Some scoffed at the idea. Others whispered prayers. The throne, after all, was more than a seat. It was a symbol of order, of history, of something that could not be rewritten by swords or scribes. And so the rivalry continued, simmering behind every trade route discussion, every court alliance, every flicker of rumor that pointed toward a white-haired girl crossing a border. The Lioness was gone. But the question of who would wear the crown she left behind remained very much alive. By the time the northern snow began to retreat into the hollows of early spring, the name Cirilla no longer traveled only in whispers. It emerged in conversations held behind drawn curtains, in letters burned after reading, and in the uncertain gazes of men and women who wondered whether the realm had truly lost its princess or merely misplaced her. The Cintran heir had become a figure of weight, not because of declarations or decrees, but because her reputation had taken on a life of its own, shaped by rumor, witness, and belief. It was not one tale that defined her, but many. In Maharkam's outer valleys, dwarven miners spoke of a white-haired girl seen crossing a bridge during a thunderstorm, barefoot and silent, her eyes like polished jade. In the free city of Novigrad, a merchant claimed to have met her at a roadside shrine, where she offered him 2 silver coins for a piece of bread and left before he could ask her name. In the woods near Brokilon, dryads who rarely spoke to humans now referred to the child of the elder seed with reverence and cautious curiosity. These accounts were scattered, fragmented, and often inconsistent. Yet something within them resonated across the continent. It was not the details that convinced, dates, distances, or dialogue. It was the pattern. Each sighting, each telling, hinted at a presence moving with purpose, surviving through clarity. She was not seen with banners or knights, yet she was remembered. Because she left something behind, an impression, a moment, a stillness that lingered. The stories spread faster than her footsteps. Among the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, the urgency surrounding her grew more concentrated. Village forts, now rising in political prominence within the magical order, sought to consolidate knowledge concerning the elder blood. He pressed his inquiries through agents. Letters were sent to scholars in Toussaint, to record keepers in Pont-Vonnies, to keepers of arcane archives buried beneath Tretogor's colleges. He wanted more than knowledge. He wanted the girl. Yennefer, meanwhile, moved without fanfare. She had tracked the girl not by trail, but by consequence, staying one step behind, measuring the ripples left behind each time Ciri passed through a town, a grove, a ruin. Where others looked for footprints, she read the silence. She noted how villagers described strange dreams after the girl's passage, how wolves moved in patterns that mimicked protection rather than pursuit. She saw the signs. Ciri was not simply moving through the world. She was changing it. At court, the princess's name re-emerged in more formal terms. In Temeria, officials debated whether her reappearance would trigger dormant treaties. In Redania, new maps were drafted showing Cintran royal territory, if reinstated. No one could agree on what would happen if she were found, but all agreed on this: her presence would alter everything. Alliances, inheritance, trade routes, nothing would remain untouched. Ciri herself, as she moved farther across the realm, remained largely unaware of the full scope her name now carried. She encountered those who recognized her, yes, but most did not. To them, she was another traveler, one more set of boots coated in dust. And yet there were moments when she sensed the weight growing around her. In a village where she helped repair a collapsed fence, a child offered her a blue ribbon and called her my lady without knowing why. In a woodland near Bruges, she found a crude carving of a lion in a hollow tree, new, unfinished, left without explanation. She had not spoken her name in months, but the world spoke it for her. The title Princess of Cintra no longer belonged to courts alone. It had become something closer to myth, adaptable, resilient, worn not by decree, but by memory. Ciri was no longer just the daughter of Pavetta, nor the granddaughter of Calanthe. She was the living fragment of a fallen kingdom, the blood thread between the past and whatever came next. And for those who heard of her, be they peasant or politician, she represented possibility. Some feared her return, believing she would invite further war. Others prayed for it, hoping her presence would galvanize unity. Still others sought her for their own ends, convinced that if they found her first, they could mold her future, and their own. But Ciri did not seek any of them. She continued onward, across fields where nothing bloomed, through forests where the wind carried old songs in forgotten languages. Her steps were quiet, but her presence grew louder with each passing day. She no longer needed a throne to be recognized. She had become her own story, one written across the faces of those who remembered Cintra not as rubble, but as resolve. And so as spring spread slowly across the land and the snow receded into memory, the question no longer was whether Ciri lived. The question was when she would return. As word of Cirilla's survival began to settle not just as rumor but as a recognized likelihood among the northern realms, the question that had once hovered tentatively, what to do with Cintra, took on new urgency. No longer was it a discussion of abstract claims or distant bloodlines. The potential return of the Cintran heir transformed whispers into councils, speculation into strategy. One by one, the northern courts began to draft plans, not only for what might happen if the princess returned, but for what would follow if the kingdom itself could be restored. In Redania, where chancellors met under the high arches of the royal archive in Tretegor, scribes unfurled parchment maps that had lain untouched since the earliest days of Nilfgaard's advance. They recalibrated border projections, marked potential trade corridors, and even proposed the re-establishment of Cintra's administrative districts. It was not announced in public. But within the tall chambers of state, there was no longer any doubt. Redania intended to be ready. Temeria took a different approach. King Foltest, ever pragmatic, convened an internal circle of advisors and military planners. Their objective was not simply territorial influence, but stability. The kingdom had already absorbed a significant portion of Cintran refugees, families displaced by conflict, skilled tradesmen, aging soldiers, and young orphans. Some towns near the southern frontier now carried more Cintran dialect than Temerian. Foltest saw both risk and opportunity. To offer reconstruction under Temerian protection could be seen as magnanimous or as overreach. The balance was delicate. And so the plans drafted in Vizima bore careful language. Restoration assistance. Infrastructure stabilization. Economic guarantees. Cadwyn, distant from Cintra's geographic borders but attentive to continental shifts, positioned itself cautiously. In the halls of Odd Caray, the High Council watched events unfold through their scouts and informants. They knew that Cintra's restoration, if mishandled, could tip the balance not only southward but across the entire north. They prepared for alignment but did not act. Their silence was intentional. In Edern, a kingdom traditionally more focused on internal affairs, the noble houses found themselves divided. Some viewed Ciri's re-emergence as a call to action, an opportunity to solidify a united north. Others, more skeptical, warned that too much faith placed in a single heir, no matter her lineage, could backfire. Nonetheless, emissaries were dispatched quietly to former Cintran allies. Bonds, however old, were being re-examined. Beyond politics, the humanitarian dimension began to take shape. Philanthropic guilds from Novigrad and Oxenfurt, sensing a potential shift, began compiling inventories of materials needed for urban reconstruction. Stone, timber, grain, tools, all things that had once flowed southward towards Cintra before the war. Now, these lists were matched against what remained. Caravans were proposed. Supply routes drafted. Even builders were quietly contracted in advance, though they were instructed to keep their assignments vague. Still, despite the activity, no one moved openly. The restoration of Cintra remained, officially, a matter unresolved. Nilfgaard still held the territory. The Southern Empire made no indication of retreat. And while its grip on the land was firmer than most expected, it was not absolute. Rebellions flickered in the countryside. Former nobles stirred in exile. And in the minds of many, Cintra was not lost, only waiting. The question of governance loomed large. Would Ciri, if she returned, rule alone? Would she serve under the influence of a northern council? Would the Skellige Giles stake their ancestral claims? Some even whispered of unification, of binding the Cintran line with another throne through marriage, alliance, or arcane contract. But these questions, while debated earnestly in some circles, were never voiced too loudly. For one truth remained above all others: Ciri herself had not yet claimed the throne. Her intentions were unknown. And so the world, for all its planning, held its breath. Amid these broader movements, ordinary people responded with quieter gestures. In the village of Rose Hollow, a carpenter began carving new doorposts for abandoned Cintran cottages, expecting a future return. In the hills near Melitel's temple, a young mother named her daughter Cirilla, though she whispered the name only at night. Near the Yaruga's Bend, a community of former Cintran soldiers met monthly to tend a makeshift monument, a ring of stones set where their comrades had once stood. Each act was small, but together, they formed the emotional architecture of a people who had not forgotten. In Brokilon, the Dryads remained silent on the matter. They neither supported nor resisted the notion of Cintra's restoration, but their patrols grew more active near the southern paths, and their seers watched the winds with greater intent. Brokilon had seen kingdoms rise and fall, had watched maps redrawn countless times. They did not fear restoration. They only feared repetition. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers, though divided in many ways, began aligning some of its more diplomatic agents toward the prospect of mediation. A restored Cintra would need magical guidance, not only to manage its arcane artifacts, some of which had gone missing in the siege, but to prevent foreign influence from distorting its magical integrity. Aretusa sent feelers, inquiries wrapped in neutral language, to key families with historical Cintran ties. And through it all, one quiet question persisted: what would Ciri choose? She had not asked for restoration. She had not declared her claim. But the world had begun to shape itself around her absence, preparing for her arrival as though it were already written. Some believed she would return with fire, reclaiming her throne by rite and ritual. Others envisioned her walking away, leaving behind royalty for a path of her own. Both were possible. Neither was known. But preparations continued nonetheless. And somewhere beyond the hills and rivers, among camps and waystones, the girl who bore the name Cintra still moved forward, unaware perhaps of the scaffolding rising in her name. In the years that followed Cintra's fall, Queen Calanthe's image passed fully from history into legend. Her deeds, once recorded with courtly precision, began to blur into songs, myths, and murmured tales passed from lips far removed from the marble halls she once ruled. But even as the details faded, the impression she left remained. To many, she was not only the ruler who had stood against Nilfgaard, she was the lion cub who roared long before the world took notice. Balladeers took particular interest in her. They favored the moments of defiance, of cunning strategy during war councils, of her armored silhouette framed against the rising sun before battle. Some claimed she had spoken to the wild wolves that prowled Cintra's hills, that they had answered her in kind. Others said her voice could quiet the raging seas of Skellige, that even the storm spirits stilled when her command rang across the water. It mattered little to audiences whether these tales were true. What mattered was that they were told, and told often. In taverns stretching from Cadwyn to the Mahakam foothills, travelling minstrels often opened their performances with a nod to the Lioness. A toast to Calanthe, they'd say, who gave her kingdom steel instead of silence. The phrase became proverbial. It appeared on the lips of old soldiers raising flasks, and on etched pendants sold by smiths who had never seen Cintra's gates but knew of its queen's defiance. Among the witches, her memory remained sharper, less romanticized. They recalled the banquet that came to be known as the Night of the Law of Surprise. Though few were present, the tale circulated Caermoran and other strongholds with unusual persistence. The story was retold not for its courtly drama, but for its binding power. What had begun as a ruse to select Pavetta's suitor became a moment of convergence, one that tied Geralt's fate to a line older than most knew. Veteran witches spoke of Calanthe as a ruler who understood necessity, even when it clashed with sentiment. She had welcomed Geralt with reserved suspicion, weighed his words with care, and offered hospitality without pretense. She was not given to false courtesy, and for a witcher accustomed to avoidance, that clarity had left its mark. She was remembered as one of the few monarchs who had treated his presence with plain calculation, and, perhaps, a measure of respect. In Oxenfurt, scholars and archivists took a different approach. They combed through surviving Cintran scrolls, cross-referencing speeches and edicts. They analyzed patterns of governance, noting her reforms in land distribution, her protection of trade convoys, and her work in stabilizing naval alliances with Skellige. For the academic mind, Calanthe's legend was not built on myth alone. It was founded on effective rule. That she had fought in armor was known. That she had negotiated economic treaties on the same day was equally noted. And yet, for all her stature, it was the memory of her in private moments that endured most deeply among those who had served her closely. An aging steward, once part of her court, spoke of how she walked the gardens at dusk, humming to herself. A midwife remembered the way she had clasped Pavetta's hand during Ciri's birth. These stories were not recorded in ballads, yet they carried weight. Even in the occupied ruins of Cintra, where Nilfgaardian banners flew, her presence lingered. Some soldiers claimed to hear footsteps in the old council chamber. Others, especially those new to the posting, avoided entering the Queen's personal quarters at night. The lion walks still, they'd say, half in jest. But few lingered alone. Ciri, in her own quiet way, carried these echoes with her. She had no need to recite her grandmother's deeds. They lived within her, stitched into memory through tone, gesture, and gaze. In moments of hesitation, she would recall Calanthe's steady voice. In moments of doubt, she remembered how Calanthe once knelt in the snow beside a wounded scout, binding the wound herself, while nobles watched in silence. These recollections shaped Ciri as a compass. She did not seek to become her grandmother, nor to emulate her choices precisely, but she understood the strength in knowing where she came from. Calanthe's legacy was not just throne or title. It was resilience, a refusal to yield to spectacle or despair. It was a memory sharp enough to carve direction in uncertain times. Stories of Calanthe continued to evolve. Some claimed her ghost appeared to those loyal to Cintra's heart. Others said that wolves still gathered on moonless nights at the castle's remains, howling toward the place she once stood. Whether these tales were born of nostalgia or something older, no one could say for sure, but none dared dismiss them entirely. In time, the title Lion Cub of Cintra came to rest not only on Calanthe's shoulders but upon Ciri's. Not because she inherited it, but because the people gave it. They saw in her the continuation of a fire once thought extinguished, a flame of return. And through every telling, every whispered song and rewritten scroll, one thing remained clear: Calanthe was not forgotten. She had become more than memory. In the vast sprawl of the northern continent, where kingdoms rise and wither like the turning of seasons, few names endure beyond their age. Most are reduced to a single entry in dusty scrolls, a faded seal pressed against time's indifference. Yet Cintra remains, a kingdom that, though burned, was never fully extinguished. Its legacy moves as a current beneath the surface of northern memory. It lingers in the cadence of old songs, in the line of a girl's jaw, in the weight of stories passed from elder to child beside the hearth. To the historian, Cintra's place in the great arcs of conflict is clear. It was a bulwark in the south, a threshold between the north's scattered powers and the hunger of the Nilfgaardian Empire. Its fall marked a shift not merely in borders, but in belief. It exposed the vulnerability of even the proudest realms and reminded sovereigns that legacy, without vigilance, is only echo. But to the common folk, Cintra was remembered for its spirit. For Queen Calanthe's defiance, for the bravery of those who stayed, for the roar that refused to quiet even when walls crumbled. The Lioness of Cintra became not only a symbol of resistance but of dignity. She showed what it meant to carry crown and courage in equal measure. As the years passed, the lands once bearing the Cintran banner began to speak with their own voice again. Trade resumed between its outer villages and neighboring realms. Markets reopened, selling goods made by hands that remembered old methods. Children born beneath the rebuilt roofs learned stories of Calanthe, of Pavetta, of a young princess as a symbol of the land's unbroken heart. And so when fires are lit across the hills in the depth of winter, when songs rise to meet the wind, when children chase each other across the fields where the old keep once stood, the name Cintra is spoken, not as a lament, but as a part of living memory. A word that holds courage. A place that held the line. It will not be forgotten.